Hey crew, it's Pitt and I am back with some more Esoterica. Today we are diving back into the works of Mrs. Helena Blavatsky. This is Isis Unveiled. We are on chapter 14. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It's not the format for everyone, but some people seem to find enjoyment in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material, so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of Isis Unveiled with Chapter 14. The transactions of this, our city of Sai, is recorded in our sacred writings during a period of 8,000 years. Plato, Timaeus. We have done Timaeus, Critias, and several works of Plato are in the ancient lore playlist. The Egyptians assert that from the reign of Heracles to that of Amasis, 17,000 years elapsed. Herodotus, Library 2, Chapter 43. If you would like some more on an alternative history of the planet, we have the 12,000 year disaster cycle, which can definitely help you out. Can the theologian derive no light from the pure primeval faith that glimmers from Egyptian hieroglyphics to illustrate the immortality of the soul? Will not the historian deign to notice the prior origin of every art and science in Egypt 1,000 years before the Pelasgians studied the isles and capes of the archipelago with their forts and temples? Glidden. And if you are unfamiliar, I regularly mispronounce words. How came Egypt by her knowledge? They're from Atlantis, 12,000 year disaster cycle. When broke the dawn of the civilization whose wondrous perfection is suggested by the bits and fragments supplied to us by the archaeologists? Alas, the lips of Memnon are silent and no longer utter oracles. The Sphinx has become a greater riddle in her speechlessness than was the enigma propounded by Epictetus. What Egypt taught to others, she certainly did not acquire by the international exchange of ideas and discoveries with her Semitic neighbors, nor from them did she receive her stimulus. The more we learn of the Egyptians, observes the writer of a recent article, the more marvelous they seem. From whom could she have learned her wondrous arts, the secrets of which died with her? She sent no agents throughout the world to learn what others knew, but to her the wise men of neighboring nations resorted for knowledge. Proudly secluding herself within her enchanted domain, the fair queen of the desert created wonders as if by the sway of a magical staff. Nothing, remarks the same writer, whom we have elsewhere quoted, proves that civilization and knowledge then rise and progress with her, as in the case of other peoples, but everything seems to be referable, in the same perfection, to the earliest dates. That no nation knew as much as herself is a fact demonstrated by history. May we not assign as a reason for this remark the fact that until very recently nothing was known of old India, that these two nations, India and Egypt, were akin, that they were the oldest in the group of nations, and that the eastern Ethiopians, the mighty builders, had come from India as a matured people, bringing their civilization with them and colonizing the perhaps unoccupied Egyptian territory. But we defer a more complete elaboration of this theme for our second volume. Mechanism, says Isube Salverte, was carried by the ancients to a point of perfection that has never been attained in modern times. We would inquire if their inventions have been surpassed in our age. Certainly not, and at the present day, with all the means that the progress of science and modern discovery have placed in the hands of the mechanic, have we not been assailed by numerous difficulties in striving to place on a pedestal one of these monoliths that the Egyptians 40 centuries ago erected in such numbers before their sacred edifices? It is important to note that many of the stones that were used in building the monuments in Egypt we still cannot move today. As far back as we can glance into history, to the reign of Menes, the most ancient of the kings that we know anything about, we find proofs that the Egyptians were far better acquainted with hydrostatics and hydraulic engineering than ourselves. The gigantic work of turning the course of the Nile, or rather of its three principal branches, and bringing it to Memphis, was accomplished during the reign of that monarch, who appears to us as distant in the abyss of time as a far glimmering star in the heavenly vault. Says Wilkinson, Menes took accurately the measure of the power which he had to oppose, and constructed a dike, whose lofty mounds and enormous embankments turned the water eastward, and since that time the river is contained in its new bed. Herodotus has left us a poetical but still accurate description of the lake Moeris, so called after the pharaoh who caused the artificial sheet of water to be formed. The historian has described this lake as measuring 450 miles in circumference and 300 feet in depth. It was fed through artificial channels by the Nile and made to store a portion of the annual overflow for the irrigation of the country for many miles round. Its numerous floodgates, dams, locks, and convenient engines were constructed with the greatest skill. The Romans, at a far later period, got their notions on hydraulic constructions from the Egyptians. But our latest progress in the science of hydrostatics has demonstrated the fact of a great deficiency on their part in some branches of that knowledge. Thus, for instance, if they were acquainted with that which is called in hydrostatics the great law, they seem to have been less familiar with what our modern engineers know as watertight joints. Their ignorance is sufficiently proved by their conveying the water through large level aqueducts, instead of doing it at a less expense by iron pipes beneath the surface. But the Egyptians evidently employed a far superior method in their channels and artificial waterworks. Notwithstanding this, the modern engineers employed by Lesseps for the Suez Canal, who had learned from the ancient Romans all their art could teach them, deriving, in their turn, their knowledge from Egypt, scoffed at by the suggestion that they should seek a remedy for some imperfections in their work by studying the contents of the various Egyptian museums. Nevertheless, the engineers succeeded in giving to the banks of that long and ugly ditch, as Professor Carpenter calls the Suez Canal, sufficient strength to make it a navigable waterway instead of a mud trap for vessels, as it was at first. The alluvial deposits of the Nile, during the past 30 centuries, have completely altered the area of the delta, so that it is continually growing seaward and adding to the territory of the Khedive. In ancient times, the principal mouth of the river was called Pelusium, and the canal cut by one of the kings, the Canal of Nico, led from Suez to this branch. After the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra in Actium, it was proposed that a portion of the fleet should pass through the canal to the Red Sea, which shows the depth of water that those early engineers had secured. Settlers in Colorado and Arizona have recently reclaimed large tracts of barren land by a system of irrigation, receiving from the journals of the day no little praise for their ingenuity. But, for a distance of 500 miles above Cairo, there stretches a strip of land reclaimed from the desert and made, according to Professor Carpenter, the most fertile on the face of the earth. He says, for thousands of years, these branch canals have conveyed fresh water from the Nile to fertilize the lands on this long, narrow strip, as well as of the delta. He describes the network of canals over the delta, which dates from an early period of the Egyptian monarchs. The French province of Artois has given its name to the artesian well, as though that form of engineering had first been applied in that district, but if we consult the Chinese records, we find such wells to have been in common use ages before the Christian era. If we now turn to architecture, we find displayed before our eyes wonders which baffle all description. Referring to the temples of Philae, Abu Simbel, Dendera, Edfu, and Karnak, Professor Carpenter remarks that these stupendous and beautiful erections, these gigantic pyramids and temples, have a vastness and beauty which are still impressive after the lapse of thousands of years. he is amazed at. The admirable character of the workmanship, the stones in most cases being fitted together with astonishing nicety, so that a knife could hardly be thrust between the joints. He noticed in his amateur archaeological pilgrimage another of those curious coincidences which His Holiness the Pope may feel some interest in learning. He is speaking of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, sculpted on the old monuments and ancient belief in the immortality of the soul. Now, it is most remarkable, says the professor, to see that not only this belief, but the language in which it was expressed in the ancient Egyptian times, anticipated that of the Christian revelation. For, in this Book of the Dead, there are used the very phrases we find in the New Testament in connection with the Day of Judgment. And he admits that this hierogram was engraved probably 2,000 years before the time of Christ. That's because the entirety of the Bible has been stolen. According to Bunsen, who is considered to have made the most exact calculations, the mass of masonry in the Great Pyramid of Cheops measures 82,111,000 feet and would weigh 6,316,000 tons. 6,316,000 tons. The immense numbers of squared stones show us the unparalleled skill of the Egyptian quarrymen. Speaking of the Great Pyramid, Kendrick says, "These joints are scarcely perceptible, not wider than the thickness of silver paper, and the cement is so tenacious that fragments of the casing stones still remain in their original position, notwithstanding the lapse of many centuries and the violence by which they were detached." Who, of our modern architects and chemists, will rediscover the indestructible cement of the oldest Egyptian buildings? The skill of the ancients in quarrying, says Bunsen, is displayed the most in the extracting of the huge blocks out of which obelisks and colossal statues were hewn. Obelisks 90 feet high and statues 40 feet high, made out of one stone. There are many such. They did not blast out the blocks for these monuments, but adopted the following scientific method. Instead of using huge iron wedges, which would have split the stone, they cut a small groove for the whole length of perhaps 100 feet, and inserted it in, close to each other, a great number of dry wooden wedges, after which they poured water into the groove, and the wedges, swelling and bursting simultaneously with a tremendous force, broke out the huge stone as neatly as diamond cuts a plane of glass. I am not sure that is how that happened. I am not sure that they are even certain how that happened. I am by no means, however, an expert, so take it as you will. Modern geographers and geologists have demonstrated that these monoliths were brought from a prodigious distance, and have been at a loss to conjecture how the transport was effected, and it is important to note that that is still the case. Still today, we are 150 years after this particular work was written, and it is still true that they do not know. We cannot perform the same feat today. Old manuscripts say that it was done by the help of portable rails. These rested upon inflated bags of hide. That's wild. Rendered indestructible by the same process as that used for preserving the mummies. These ingenious air cushions prevented the rails from sinking into the deep sand. Manetho mentions them and remarks that they were so well prepared that they would endure wear and tear for centuries. That is probably untrue. Again, I am not a perfect expert on this, but I do have a bit of an interest, and so I am familiar. And many of the stones, not all of them, but many of the stones used in making the pyramids would crush any material by which they were used, right? So what that means is that they have tried to reproduce these, and what they did was they took some trees from the local area, and they attempted to move the blocks across these trees. And what happened was that the blocks crushed the trees, and they weren't able to roll on the trees. Now, this is saying rails, which is slightly different, but that would imply that they were using some type of a metal. The metal would wear upon The rocks, there would be significant marking. The weight would probably break them. And the fact that they're saying that they used an airbag made out of hide is simply ridiculous. There's no way that's going to work. The date of the hundreds of pyramids in the Valley of the Nile is impossible to fix by any of the rules of modern science, but Herodotus informs us that each successive king erected one to commemorate his reign and to serve as his sepulcher. And again, that is something that is not true, right? Sepulcher implies that there is someone buried there. There were nobody found in the pyramids. There were things that they called coffins, but there was no evidence that there was ever anybody whatsoever placed inside of them. But Herodotus did not tell all, although he knew that the real purpose of the pyramid was very different from that which he assigns to it. Were it not for his religious scruples, he might have added that, externally, it symbolized the creative principle of nature and illustrated also the principles of geometry, mathematics, astrology, and astronomy. Internally, it was a majestic fane, in whose somber recesses were performed the mysteries, and whose walls had often witnessed the initiation scenes of members of the royal family. That is probably true. The porphyry sarcophagus, which Professor Piazzi Smith, astronomer royal of Scotland, degrades into a corn bin, was the baptismal font, upon emerging from which the neophyte was born again and became an adept. This is probably a self-insertion by Christianity, right? Christianity has a real good habit of that. They say, oh, this thing is slightly similar to something that we do, so it must be what they were doing. There is no reason to believe that there was a baptismal font in the religion of Egypt. As far as I am aware, right, I have not come across anything that would imply that. But again, I am not a scholar of Egypt. I am just interested. Herodotus gives us, however, a just idea of the enormous labor expended in transporting one of these gigantic blocks of granite. It measured 32 feet in length, 21 feet in width, and 12 feet in height. Its weight, he estimates, to be rising 300 tons, which, again, is beyond the capacity of the Romans several centuries later. And it occupied 2,000 men for 3 years to move it from Syene to the Delta, down to the Nile. Gliddon, in his Ancient Egypt, quotes from Pliny a description of the arrangements for moving the obelisk, erected at Alexandria by Ptolemaeus Philadelphus. A canal was dug from the Nile to the place where the obelisk lay. 2 boats were floated under it, and they were weighted with stones containing 1 cubic foot each. And the weight of the obelisk, having been calculated by the engineers, the cargo of the boats was exactly proportioned to it, so that they should be sufficiently submerged to pass under the monolith as it lay across the canal. Then the stones were gradually removed, the boats rose, lifted the obelisk, and was floated down the river. In the Egyptian section of the Dresden, or Berlin Museum, we forget which, is a drawing which represents a workman ascending an unfinished pyramid with a basket of sand upon his back. This has suggested to certain Egyptologists the idea that the blocks of the pyramid were chemically manufactured in loco. That is the geopolymer theory, which is almost certainly not true as well. Some modern engineers believe that Portland cement, a double silicate of lime and alumina, is the imperishable cement of the ancients. But, on the other hand, Professor Carpenter asserts that the pyramids, with the exception of their granite casings, is formed of what geologists call nummulitic limestone. This is newer than the old chalk and is made of the shells of animals called nummulites, little pieces of money about the size of a shilling. However, this moot question may be decided. No one, from Herodotus and Pliny down to the last wandering engineer who has gazed upon these imperial monuments of long crumbled dynasties, has been able to tell us how the gigantic masses were transported and set up in place. Again, that is still true today. Bunsen concedes to Egypt an antiquity of 20,000 years. But even in this matter, we would be left to conjecture if we depended upon modern authorities. They can neither tell us for what the pyramids were constructed, under what dynasty the first was raised, nor the material of which they were built. All is conjecture with them. Some of these things have been answered, right? We do know what they are made of. That's one we have done extensive surveys and extensive experimentation inside the pyramid. We have just recently found a brand new chamber that has not even been opened and explored yet. But most of this is still not answered. Professor Smith has given us by far the most accurate mathematical description of the Great Pyramid to be found in literature. But after showing the astronomical bearings of the structure, he so little appreciates ancient Egyptian thought that he actually maintains that the porphyry sarcophagus in the king's chamber is the unit of measure for the two most enlightened nations of the earth, England and America. One of the Book of Hermes describes certain pyramids as standing on the seashore, the waves of which dashed in powerless fury against its base. This implies that the geographical features of the countries have been changed, and may indicate that we must accord to these ancient granaries, magico-astrological observatories, and royal sepulchres an origin, antedating the upheaval of the Sahara Desert and other deserts. This would imply, rather, more of an antiquity than the few poor thousands of years so generously accorded to them by the Egyptologist. And again, if you would like more information on this particular part, the 12,000 year disaster cycle is a good place to start. We talk in extensive detail about how this may have happened. Dr. Ribaud, a French archaeologist of some renown, gives his readers a glimpse of the culture which prevailed 5,000 years BC by saying that there were at that time no less than 30 or 40 colleges of the priests who studied occult sciences and practical magic. A writer in the National Quarterly Review, volume 32, December 1875, says that the recent excavations made among the ruins of Carthage have brought to light traces of a civilization, a refinement of art and luxury which must have even outshone that of ancient Rome. And when the fiat went forth, Delenda est Carthago, the mistress of the world, well knew that she was about to destroy a greater than herself, for, while one empire swayed the world by force of arms alone, the other was the last and most perfect representative of a race who had, for centuries before Rome was dreamed of, directed the civilization, the learning, and the intelligence of mankind. This Carthage is the one which, according to Appian, was standing as early as BC 1234, or 50 years before the taking of Troy, and not the one popularly supposed to have been built by Dido, Elissa, or Astarte, 4 centuries later. Here we have still another illustration of the truth of the doctrine of cycles. Draper's admissions as to the astronomical erudition of the ancient Egyptians are singularly supported by an interesting fact quoted by Mr. J. M. Peoples from a lecture delivered in Philadelphia by the late Professor O. M. Mitchell, the astronomer. Upon the coffin of a mummy, now in the British Museum, was delineated the zodiac with the exact positions of the planets at the time of the autumnal equinox, in the year 1722 BC. Professor Mitchell calculated the exact position of the heavenly bodies belonging to our solar system at the time indicated. The result, says Mr. Peoples, I give in his own words. To my astonishment, it was found that on the 7th of October 1722 BC, the moon and the planets had occupied the exact points in heaven marked upon the coffin in the British Museum. Professor John Fiske, in his onslaught on Dr. Draper's History of the Intellectual Development of Europe, sets his pen against the doctrine of cyclical progression, remarking that We have never known the beginning or the end of an historic cycle, and have no inductive warrant for believing that we are now traversing one. He chides the author of that eloquent and thoughtful work for the odd disposition exhibited throughout his work, not only to refer the best part of Greek culture to an Egyptian source, but uniformly to exalt the non-European civilization at the expense of the European. We believe that this odd disposition might be directly sanctioned by the confessions of the great Grecian historians themselves. Again, see the Ancient Lore playlist, particularly Critias and Timaeus. Professor Fisk might, with profit, read Herodotus over again. The father of history confesses that more than once that Greece owes everything to Egypt. As to his assertion that the world has never known the beginning or the end of a historical cycle, we have but to cast a retrospective glance on the many glorious nations which have passed away, in example, reached the end of their great national cycle. Compare the Egypt of that day with its perfection of art, science, and religion, its glorious cities and monuments, and its swarming population, with the Egypt of today, peopled with strangers, its ruins the abode of bats and snakes, and a few Copts, the sole surviving heirs to all this grandeur, and see whether the cyclical theory does not reassert itself. Says Glidden, who is now contradicted by Mr. Fisk. Philologists, astronomers, chemists, painters, architects, physicians must return to Egypt to learn the origin of language and writing, of the calendar and solar motion, of the art of cutting granite with a copper chisel, and of giving elasticity to a copper sword, of making glass with the variegated hues of the rainbow, of moving single blocks of polished syenite, 900 tons in weight for any distance, by land and water, of building arches rounded and pointed, with Masonic precision unsurpassed at the present day, and antecedent by 2,000 years to the Cloaca Magna of Rome, of sculpturing a Doric column 1,000 years before the Dorians are known in history, of fresco painting in imperishable colors, of practical knowledge in anatomy, and of time-defying Egyptian of pyramid building. Every craftsman can behold in Egyptian monuments the progress of his art 4,000 years ago, and whether it be a wheelwright building a chariot, a shoemaker drawing his twine, a leather cutter using the self-same form of knife of old as is considered the best form now, a weaver throwing the same hand shuttle, a whitesmith using that identical form of plow pipe, but lately recognized to be the most efficient, the seal engraver cutting in hieroglyphics such name as Skuhos above 4,300 years ago. All these and many more astounding evidences of Egyptian priority now require but a glance at the plates of Rossellini. Truly, exclaims Mr. Peebles, these Ramsaean temples and tombs was much a marvel to the Grecian Herodotus as they are to us. But even then, the merciless hand of time had left its traces upon their structures, and some of them, whose very memory would be lost were it not for the Book of Hermes, has been swept away into the oblivion of the ages. King after king and dynasty after dynasty had passed in a glittering pageant before the eyes of succeeding generations, and their renown had filled the habitable globe. The same pall of forgetfulness had fallen upon them and their monuments alike before the first of our historical authorities, Herodotus, preserved for posterity the remembrance of that wonder of the world, the great labyrinth. The long-accepted biblical chronology has so cramped the minds of not only the clergy, but even our scarce unfettered scientists, that in treating of prehistoric remains in different parts of the world, a constant fear is manifested on their part to trespass beyond the period of 6,000 years, hitherto allowed by theology as the age of the world, and that is, again, absolutely ridiculous in light of evidence. There is a 6,000 year ago disaster. That was the flood of Noah. That was 6,000 years ago, and 6,000 years prior to that was Eve and Eden. Herodotus found the labyrinth already in ruins, but nevertheless his admiration for the genius of its builders knew no bounds. He regarded it as far more marvelous than the pyramids themselves, and, as an eyewitness, minutely describes it. The French and Prussian savants, as well as other Egyptologists, agree as to the emplacement and identified its noble ruins. Moreover, they confirm the account given of it by the old historian. Herodotus says that he found therein 3,000 chambers, half subterranean and the other half above ground. The upper chambers, he says, I myself passed through and examined in detail. In the underground ones, which may exist till now for all the archaeologists know, the keepers of the building would not let me in, for they contain the sepulchres of the kings who built the labyrinth, and also those of the sacred crocodiles. The upper chambers I saw and examined with my own eyes, and found them to excel all other human productions. In Rawlinson's translation, Herodotus is made to say, the passages through the houses and the varied windings of the path across the courts excited in me infinite admiration as I passed from the courts into the chambers, and from thence into colonnades, and from colonnades into other houses, and again into courts unseen before. The roof was throughout of stone like the walls, and both were exquisitely carved all over with figures. Every court was surrounded with a colonnade, which was built of white stones, sculptured most exquisitely. At the corner of the labyrinth stands a pyramid 40 fathoms high, with large figures engraved on it, and it is entered by a vast subterranean passage. If such was the labyrinth, when viewed by Herodotus, what, in such a case, was ancient Thebes? The city destroyed far earlier than the period of Sammamedicus, who himself reigned 530 years after the destruction of Troy. We find that in his time Memphis was the capital, while the glorious Thebes there remained but ruins. Now, if we, who are enabled to form our estimate only by the ruin of what was already ruins so many ages before our era, are stupefied in their contemplation, what must have been the general aspect of the Thebes in its day of glory? Karnak temple, palace, ruins, or whatsoever the archaeologist may term it, is now its only representative. Karnak is an impressive rabbit hole to go down, but solitary and alone as it stands, fit emblems of majestic empire as if forgotten by time in the onward march of the centuries. It testifies to the art and skill of the ancients. He must be indeed devoid of the spiritual perception of genius who fails to feel, as well as to see, the intellectual grandeur of the race that planned and built it. Champollion, who passed almost his entire life in the exploration of archaeological remains, gives vent to his emotions in the following descriptions of Karnak. The ground covered by the mass of remaining buildings is square, and each side measures 1,800 feet. One is astounded and overcome by the grandeur of the sublime remnants, the prodigality and magnificence of workmanship to be seen everywhere. No people of ancient or modern times has conceived the art of architecture upon a scale so sublime, so grandiose as it existed among the ancient Egyptians, and the imagination, which in Europe soars far above our porticos, arrests himself and falls powerless at the foot of the 140 columns of the hypostyle of Karnak. In one of its halls, the Cathedral of Notre Dame might stand and not touch the ceiling, but be considered as a small ornament in the center of the hall. It is easy to overlook this particular number, right? 1,800 feet is large. A writer in a number of an Egyptian periodical of 1870, evidently speaking with the authority of a traveler who describes what he has seen, expresses himself as follows: courts, halls, gateways, pillars, obelisks, monolithic figures, sculptures, long rows of sphinxes are found in such profusion at Karnak that the sight is too much for modern comprehension. Says Dinon, the French traveler, it is hardly possible to believe, after seeing it, in the reality of the existence of so many buildings collected together on a single point, in their dimensions, in the resolute perseverance which their construction required, and in the incalculable expense of so much magnificence. It is necessary that the reader should fancy what is before him to be a dream, as he who views the objects themselves occasionally yields to the doubt whether he be perfectly awake. There are lakes and mountains within the periphery of the sanctuary. These two edifices are selected as examples from a list next to inexhaustible. The whole valley and delta of the Nile, from the cataracts to the sea, was covered with temples, palaces, tombs, pyramids, obelisks, and pillars. The execution of the sculptures is beyond praise. The mechanical perfection with which artists wrought in granite, serpentine, breccia, and basalt is wonderful, according to all the experts. Animals and plants look as good as natural, and artificial objects are beautifully sculptured. Battles by sea and land, and scenes of domestic life are to be found in all their bas-reliefs. These monuments, says an English author, which there strike the traveler, fill his mind with great ideas. At the sight of the colossuses and superb obelisk, which seem to surpass the limits of human nature, he cannot help exclaiming, "This was the work of man," and this sentiment seems to ennoble his existence. In his turn, Dr. Richardson, speaking of the Temple of Dendera, says, "The female figures are so extremely well executed that they do all but speak. They have a mildness of feature, an expression that was never surpassed. Every one of these stones is covered with hieroglyphics, and the more ancient they are, the more beautifully we find them chiseled. Does this not furnish a new proof that history got its first glimpse of the ancients when the arts were already fast degenerating among them? The obelisks had their inscriptions cut 2 inches, and sometimes more in depth, and they are cut with the highest degree of perfection. Some ideas may be formed of their depth from the fact that the Arabs, for a small fee, will climb sometimes to the very top of an obelisk by inserting their toes and fingers in the excavations of the hieroglyphics. That all of these works, in which solidity rivals the beauty of their execution, were done before the days of the Exodus, there remains no historical doubt whatever. All the archaeologists now agree in saying that the further back we go in history, the better and finer become these arts. These views clash again with the individual opinion of Mr. Fiske, who would have us believe that the sculptures upon these monuments of Egypt, Hindustan, and Assyria, moreover, betoken a very undeveloped condition of artistic faculties. Nay, the learned gentleman goes farther, joining his voice in the opposition against the claims of learning, which belongs by right to the sacerdotal castes of antiquity, to that of Lewis. He contemptuously remarks that the extravagant theory of a profound science possessed by the Egyptian priesthood from a remote antiquity and imparted to itinerant Greek philosophers has been utterly destroyed by Sir G.C. Lewis, while, with regards to Egypt and Hindustan, as well as Assyria, it may be said that the colossal monuments which have adorned these countries since prehistoric times bear witness to the former prevalence of a barbaric despotism, totally incompatible with social nobility, and therefore with well-sustained progress. Oh, the humility! A curious argument indeed. If the size and grandeur of public monuments are to serve to our posterity as a standard by which to approximately estimate the progress of civilization attained by their builders, it may be prudent, perhaps, for America, so proud of her alleged progress and freedom, to dwarf her buildings at once to one story. Otherwise, according to Professor Fiske's theory, the archaeologist of AD 3877 will be applying to the Ancient America of 1877, The Rule of Lewis, and say that the ancient United States may be considered as a great latifundium, or plantation, cultivated by the entire population as the king's president's slaves. Is it because the white-skinned Aryan races were never born builders, like the Eastern Ethiopians or dark-skinned Caucasians, and therefore never able to compete with the latter in such colossal sculptures, that we must jump at the conclusion that these grandiose temples and pyramids could only have been erected under the whip of a merciless despot? Strange logic. It would really seem more prudent to hold to the rigorous canons of criticism laid down by Lewis and Grote, and honestly confess at once that we really know little about these ancient nations, and that, except so far as purely hypothetical speculations go, unless we study in the same direction as the ancient priests did, we have as little chance in the future. We only know what they allow the uninitiated to know, but the little we do learn of them by deduction ought to be sufficient to assure us that, even in the 19th century, with all our claims to supremacy in arts and sciences, we are totally unable, we will not say, to build anything like the monuments of Egypt, Hindustan, or Assyria, but even to rediscover the least of the ancient lost arts. That's still true. Besides, Sir Gardner Wilkinson gives forcible expression to this view of the exhumed treasures of old by adding that he can find no primitive mode of life, no barbarous customs, but a sort of stationary civilization from the most remote periods. Thus far, archaeology disagrees with geology, which affirms that the further they trace the remains of men, the more barbarous they find them. It is doubtful if geology has even yet exhausted the field of research afforded her in the caves, and the view of geologists, which are based upon present experience, may be radically modified when they come to discover the remains of the ancestors of the people whom they now style the cave dwellers. What better illustrates the theory of cycles than the following fact? Nearly 700 years B.C., in the schools of Thales and Pythagoras, was taught the doctrine of the true motion of the earth, its form, and the whole heliocentric system. And in 317 A.D., we find Lactantius, the preceptor of Crispus Caesar, son of Constantine the Great, teaching his pupil that the earth was a plain, surrounded by the sky, which is composed of fire and water, and warning him against the heretical doctrine of the earth's globular form. Whenever in the pride of some new discovery we throw a look in the past, we find, to our dismay, certain vestiges which indicate the possibility, if not certainty, that the alleged discovery was not totally unknown to the ancients. It is generally asserted that neither the early inhabitants of the Mosaic times, nor even the more civilized nations of the Ptolemaic period, were acquainted with electricity. If we remain undisturbed in this opinion, it is not for lack of proofs to the contrary. We may disdain to search for a profounder meaning in some characteristic sentences of Servius and other writers. We cannot so obliterate them but that, at some future day, the meaning will appear to us in all its significant truths. The first inhabitants of the earth, says he, never carried fire to their altars, but by their prayers they brought down the heavenly fire. Prometheus discovered and revealed to man the art of bringing down lightning, and by the method which he taught to them, they brought down fire from the region above. If, after pondering these words, we are still willing to attribute to them the phraseology of mythological fables, we may turn to the days of Numa, the king philosopher, so renowned for his esoteric learning, and find ourselves more embarrassed to deal with his case. We can neither accuse him of ignorance, superstition, nor credulity, for, if history can be believed at all, he was intently bent on destroying polytheism and idol worship. He had so well dissuaded the Romans from idolatry that for nearly 2 centuries neither statues nor images appeared in their temples. On the other hand, old historians tell us that the knowledge which Numa possessed in natural physics was remarkable. Tradition says that he was initiated by the priests of the Etruscan divinities and instructed by them in the secret of forcing Jupiter, the thunderer, to descend upon earth. Ovid shows that Jupiter Eleusis began to be worshipped by the Romans from that time. Salverte is of the opinion that before Franklin discovered his refined electricity, Numa had experimented with it most successfully, and that Tullus Hostilius was the first victim of the dangerous heavenly guest recorded in history. Titus Livy and Pliny narrate that this prince, having found in the books of Numa instructions on the secret sacrifices offered to Jupiter Eleusis, made a mistake, and, in consequence of it, he was struck by lightning and consumed in his own palace. Salverte remarks that Pliny, in the exposition of Numa's scientific secrets, makes use of the expressions which seem to indicate two distinct processes. The one obtained thunder, impetare, and the other forced it to lightning, cogere. Guided by Numa's book, says Lucius, quoted by Pliny, Tullus undertook to invoke the aid of Jupiter, but, having performed the rite imperfectly, he perished, struck by thunder. Tracing back the knowledge of thunder and lightning possessed by the Etruscan priest, we can find that Tarchon, the founder of the theurgism of the former, desiring to preserve his house from lightning, surrounded it by a hedge of white brony, a climbing plant, which has the property of averting thunderbolts. Tarchon, the theurgist, was much anterior to the siege of Troy. The pointed metallic lightning rod, for which we are seemingly indebted to Franklin, is probably a rediscovery after all. There are many metals which seem to strongly indicate that the principle was anciently known. The temple of Juno had its roof covered with a quantity of pointed blades of swords. If we possess but little proof of the ancients having had any clear notions as to all the effects of electricity, there is very strong evidence, at all events, of their having been perfectly acquainted with electricity itself. Ben David, says the author of the Occult Sciences, has asserted that Moses possessed some knowledge of the phenomena of electricity. I say the same thing. See the Unconventional Bible Study, and particularly in Exodus, if you would like more of that. Professor Hurt of Berlin is of this opinion. Michaelius remarks, firstly, that there is no indication that lightning ever struck the Temple of Jerusalem during 1,000 years. Secondly, that according to Josephus, a forest of points of gold and very sharp covered the roof of the temple. Thirdly, that this roof communicated with the caverns in the hill upon which the temple was situated by means of pipes in connection with the gilding which covered all the exterior of the building, in consequence of which the points would act as conductors. Ammianus Marcellinus, a famous historian of the 4th century, a writer generally esteemed for the fairness and correctness of his statements, tells that the Magi preserved perpetually in their furnaces fire that they miraculously got from heaven. There is a sentence in the Hindu Upanishad which runs thus: to know fire, the sun, the moon, and lightning is 3/4 of the science of God. Finally, Salverte shows that in the days of Ctesias, India was acquainted with the use of conductors of lightning. This historian plainly states that iron placed at the bottom of a fountain, and made in the form of a sword with the point upward, possessed, and soon as it was thus fixed in the ground, the property of averting storms and lightnings. What can be plainer? Some modern writers deny the fact that a great mirror was placed in the lighthouse of the Alexandrian port, for the purpose of discovering vessels at a distance at sea. But the renowned Buffon believed in it, for he honestly confesses that, if the mirror really existed, as I firmly believe it did, to the ancients belonged the honor of the invention of the telescope. Stevens, in his work on the East, asserts that he found railroads in Upper Egypt whose grooves were coated with iron. Canova, Powers, and other celebrated sculptors for our modern age deem it an honor to be compared with Phidias of old, and strict truth would, perhaps, hesitate at such a flattery. Professor Jowett discredits the story in the Atlantis in the Timaeus, and the records of 8,000 and 9,000 years appear to him an ancient swindle. But Bunsen remarks, "There is nothing improbable in itself in reminiscences and records of great events in Egypt 9,000 years B.C., for the origines of Egypt go back to the 9th millennium before Christ. How then about the primitive Cyclopean fortresses of ancient Greece? Can the walls of Tyrants, about which, according to the archaeological accounts, even among the ancients it was reported to have been the work of the Cyclops, be deemed posterior to the pyramids? Masses of rock, some equal to a cube of 6 feet, and the smallest of which, Pausanias says, could never be moved by a yoke of oxen, laid up in walls of solid masonry 25 feet thick and over 40 feet high, still believed to be the work of men of races known to our history." Wilkinson's researches have brought to light the fact that many inventions of what we term modern, and upon which we plume ourselves, were perfected by the ancient Egyptians. The newly discovered papyrus of Ebers, the German archaeologist, proves that neither our modern chignons, skin-beautifying pearl powers, nor eau dentifrices were secrets to them. More than one modern physician, even among those who advertise themselves as having made a specialty of nervous disorders, may find his advantage in consulting the medical book of Hermes, which contains prescriptions of real therapeutic value. The Egyptians, as we have seen, excelled in all arts. They made paper so excellent in quality as to be time-proof. "They took out the pith of the papyrus," says our anonymous writer previously mentioned, "dissected and opened the fiber, and flattened it by a process known to them, made it as thin as our foolscap paper, but much more durable. They sometimes cut it into strips and glued it together. Many of such written documents are yet in existence. The papyrus found in the tomb of the Queen's mummy, and another one found in the sarcophagus of the Chambre de la Reine at Giza, present the appearance of the finest glossy white muslin, while it possesses the durability of the best calf parchment. For a long time the savants believed the papyrus to have been introduced by Alexander the Great, as they erroneously imagined a good many more things, but Lepsius found rolls of papyri in tombs, and monuments of the 12th dynasty. Sculptured pictures of papyri were found later on monuments of the 4th dynasty. And now it is proved that the art of writing was known and used as early as the days of Menes, the proto-monarch. And thus it was finally discovered that the art and their system of writing were perfect and complete from the very first. It is to Champollion that we owe the first interpretation of their weird writing, and, but for his lifelong labor, we would till now remain uninformed as to the meaning of all those pictured letters, and the ancients would still be considered ignorant by the moderns, whom they so greatly excelled in some arts and sciences. He was the first to find out what wondrous tale the Egyptians had to tell, for one who could read their endless manuscripts and records. He left them on every spot and age of object capable of receiving characters. They engraved and chiseled and sculptured them on monuments. They traced them on furniture, rocks, stones, walls, coffins, and tombs, as on the papyrus. The pictures of their daily lives, in their smallest details, are being now unraveled before our dazzled eyes in the most wondrous ways. Nothing of what we know seems to have been overlooked by the ancient Egyptians. The history of Sesostris tells us how well he and his people were versed in the art and practice of war. The pictures show how formidable they were when encountered in battle. They constructed war engines. Horner says that though each of the 100 gates of Thebes issued 200 men with horses and chariots, The latter were magnificently constructed and very light in comparison with our modern heavy, clumsy, and uncomfortable artillery wagons. Kenrick describes them in the following terms. In short, as all the essential principles which regulate the construction and draught of carriages are exemplified in the war chariots of the Pharaohs, there is nothing which modern taste and luxury have devised for their decoration to which we do not find a prototype in the monuments of the 18th dynasty. Springs, metallic springs, have been found in them, and, notwithstanding Wilkinson's superficial investigation in that direction, and the description of his studies, we find proofs that such were used to prevent the jolting in the chariots in their too rapid course. The bas-reliefs show us certain melees and battles in which we can find and trace their uses and customs to the smallest details. The heavily armed men fought in coats of mail. The infantry had quilted tunics and felt helmets, with metallic coverings to protect them the better. Muratori, the modern Italian inventor who, some 10 years ago, introduced his impenetrable cuirass, has but followed in his invention what he can make out of the ancient method which suggested to him the idea. The process of rendering such objects as cardboard, felt, and other tissues impenetrable to the cuts and thrusts of any sharp weapon is now numbered among the lost arts. Muratori succeeded but imperfectly in preparing such felt cuirasses, and, notwithstanding the boasted achievements of modern chemistry, he could derive from it no preparation adequate to effect his object, and failed. To what perfection chemistry had reached in ancient times may be inferred from a fact mentioned by Vieri. In his dissertations he shows that Asclepiodotus, a general of Mithridates, reproduced chemically the deleterious exhalations of the sacred grotto. These vapors, like those of Curnay, threw the Pythoness into the mantic frenzy. Egyptians used bows, double-edged swords and daggers, javelins, spears, and pikes. The light troops were armed with darts and slings. Charioteers wielded maces and battle-axes. In siege operations they were perfect. The assailants, says the anonymous writer, advanced, forming a narrow and long line, the point being protected by a triple-sided, impenetrable engine, pushed before them on a kind of roller by an invisible squad of men. They had covered underground passages with trapdoors, scaling ladders, and the art of escalade and military strategy was carried by them to perfection. The battering ram was familiar to them as other things. Being such experts in quarrying, they knew how to set a mine to a wall and bring it down. The same writer remarks that it is a great deal safer for us to mention what the Egyptians did than what they did not know, for every day brings some new discovery of their wonderful knowledge. And if, he adds, we were to find out that they used Armstrong guns, this fact would not be much more astonishing than many of the facts brought out to light already. The proof that they were proficient in mathematical sciences lies in the fact that those ancient mathematicians whom we honor as the fathers of geometry went to Egypt to be instructed. Says Professor Smith, as quoted by Mr. Peoples, "The geometrical knowledge of the pyramid builders began where Euclid's ended. Before Greece came into existence, the arts, with the Egyptians, were ripe and old. Land measuring, an art resting on geometry, the Egyptians certainly knew well, as, according to the Bible, Joshua, after conquering the Holy Land, had skill enough to divide it. And how could a people so skilled in natural philosophy as the Egyptians were, not be proportionally skilled in psychology and spiritual philosophy? The temple was the nursery of the highest civilization, and it alone possessed the higher knowledge of magic, which was, in itself, the quintessence of natural philosophy. The occult powers of nature were taught in the greatest secrecy, and the most wonderful cures were performed during the performing of the mysteries. Herodotus acknowledges that the Greeks learned all they knew, including the sacred services of the temple, from the Egyptians, and because of that their principal temples were consecrated to Egyptian divinities. Melampus, the famous healer and soothsayer of Argos, had to use his medicines after the manner of the Egyptians, from whom he had gained his knowledge, whenever he desired a cure to be thoroughly effective. He healed Iphiclus of his impotency and debility by the rust of iron, according to the directions of Mantis, his magnetic sleeper, or oracle. Sprengel gives many wonderful instances of such magical cures in his History of Medicine. See page 119. Diodorus, in his work on the Egyptians, Library 1, says that Isis has deserved immortality for all nations of the earth to bear witness to the power of the goddess to cure diseases by her influence. This is proved, he says, not by fable as among the Greeks, but by authentic facts. Galen records several remedial means which were preserved in the healing wards of the temples. He mentions also a universal medicine, which in his time was called Isis. The doctrines of several Greek philosophers who had been instructed in Egypt demonstrates their profound learning. Orpheus, who, according to Artapanus, was a disciple of Moses, Pythagoras, Herodotus, and Plato owed their philosophy to the same temples in which the wise Solon was instructed by the priest. Anticletes relates, says Pliny, that the Ladas were invented in Egypt by a person whose name was Menon, 15 years before Pharaonius, the most ancient king of Greece. Jablonski proves that the heliocentric system, as well as the Earth's sphericity, were known by the priests of Egypt from memorial ages. This theory, he adds, Pythagoras took from the Egyptians, who had it from the Brahmins of India. Fenelon, the illustrious Archbishop of Cambrai, in his Lives of the Ancient Philosophers, credits Pythagoras with his knowledge, and says that besides teaching his disciples that as the earth was round there were antipodes, since it was inhabited everywhere, the great mathematician was the first to discover that the morning and evening star was the same. If we now consider that Pythagoras lived in about the 16th Olympiad, over 700 years BC, and taught this fact at such an early period, we must believe that it was known by others before him. The works of Aristotle, Laertius, and several others, in which Pythagoras is mentioned, demonstrate that he had learned from the Egyptians about the obliquity of the ecliptic, the starry composition of the Milky Way, and the borrowed light of the moon. Wilkinson, corroborated later by others, says that the Egyptians divided time, knew the true length of the year and the precession of the equinoxes. By recording the rising and setting of the stars, they understood the particular influences which proceeded from the positions and conjunctions of all heavenly bodies, and therefore their priests, prophesying as accurately as our modern astronomers, meteorological changes, could, en plus, astralize through astral motions. Though the sober and eloquent Cicero may be partially right in his indignation against the exaggerations of the Babylonian priests, who assert that they have preserved upon monuments observations extending back during an interval of 470,000 years. Still, the period at which astronomy had arrived at its perfection with the ancients is beyond the reach of modern calculation. A writer in one of our scientific journals observes that every science in its growth passes through 3 stages. First, we have the stage of observation, when facts are collected and registered by many minds in many places. Next, we have the stage of generalization, when these carefully verified facts are arranged methodically, generalized systematically, and classified logically, so as to deduce and elucidate from them the laws that regulate their rule and order. Lastly, we have the stage of prophecy, when these laws are so applied that the events can be predicted to occur with unerring accuracy. If several thousand years BC, Chinese and Chaldean astronomers predicted eclipses, the latter, whether by the cycle of Sarnos or other means, matters not. The fact remains the same. They had reached the last and highest stage of astronomical science. They prophesied. If they could, in the year 1722 BC, delineate the zodiac with the exact positions of the planets at the time of the autumnal equinox, and so unerringly as Professor Mitchell, the astronomer, proved, then they knew the laws that regulate carefully verified facts to perfection, and applied them with as much certainty as our modern astronomers. Moreover, astronomy is said to be in our century the only science which has thoroughly reached the last stage. Other sciences are yet in various stages of growth. Electricity, in some branches, has reached the third stage, but in many branches is still in its infantine period. This we know on the exasperating confessions of men of science themselves, and we can entertain no doubt as to this sad reality in the 19th century, as we belong ourselves to it. Not so in relation to the men who lived in the days of the glory of Chaldea, Assyria, and Babylon. Of the stages they reached in other sciences, we know nothing, except that in astronomy they stood equal with us, for they had also reached the third and last stage. In his lecture on the lost arts, Wendell Phillips very artistically describes the situation. "We seem to imagine," says he, "that whether knowledge will die with us or not, it suddenly began with us. We have a pitying estimate, a tender pity for the narrowness, ignorance, and darkness of bygone ages." To illustrate our own idea with the closing sentence of a favorite lecturer, we may as well confess that we undertook this chapter, which, in one sense, interrupts our narrative, to inquire of our men of science whether they are sure that they are boasting on the right line. Thus we read of a people who, according to some learned writers, had just emerged from the Bronze Age into the succeeding Age of Iron. If Chaldea, Assyria, and Babylon presented stupendous and venerable antiquities reaching far back into the night of time, Persia was not without her wonders of a later date. The pillared halls of Persepolis were filled with miracles of art, carvings, sculptures, enamels, alabaster libraries, obelisks, sphinxes, colossal bulls. Ecbatana in Media, the cool summer retreat of the Persian kings, was defended by 7 encircling walls of hewn and polished blocks, the interior ones in succession of increasing height and of different colors, in astrological accordance with the 7 planets. The palace was roofed with silver tiles. Its beams were plated with gold. At midnight in its halls the sun was rivaled by many a row of naphtha cressets. A paradise, that luxury of the monarchs of the East, was planted in the midst of the city. The Persian Empire was truly the garden of the world. In Babylon there still remained its walls, once more than 60 miles in compass, and, after the ravages of 3 centuries and 3 conquerors, still more than 80 feet in height. There was still the ruins of the Temple of the Cloud-encompassed Bell. On its top was planted the observatory wherein the weird Chaldean astronomers had held nocturnal communion with the stars. Still, there were vestiges of the 2 palaces with their hanging gardens, in which were trees growing in mid-air, and the wreck of the hydraulic machinery that had supplied them from the river. Into the artificial lake, with its vast apparatus of aqueducts and sluices, the melted snows of the Armenian mountains found their way, and were confined in their course through the city by the embankments of the Euphrates. Most wonderful of all, perhaps, was the tunnel under the river bed. In his First Traces of Man in Europe, Albrecht Müller proposes a name descriptive of the age in which we live, and suggests that the age of paper is perhaps as good as any that can be discussed. We do not agree with the learned professor. Our firm opinion is that the succeeding generations will term ours, at best, the age of brass, at worst, that of Albada or Oride. The thought of the present-day commentator and critic as to the ancient learning is limited to and runs around the exotericism of the temples. His insight is either unwilling or unable to penetrate into the solemn adita of old. where the Hierophant instructed the neophyte to regard the public worship in its true light. No ancient sage would have taught that man is the king of creation, and that the starry heaven and our Mother Earth was created for his sake. He who doubts the assertion may turn to the magical and philosophical precepts of Zoroaster and find its corroboration in the following. Direct not thy mind to the vast measures of the earth, for the plant of truth is not upon the ground. Nor measure the measures of the sun, collecting rules, for he is carried by the eternal will of the Father, not for your sake. Dismiss the impetuous course of the moon, for she runs always by work of necessity. The progression of the stars was not generated for your sake. A rather strange teaching to come from those who are universally believed to have worshipped the sun and moon and the starry host as gods. The sublime profundity of the Magian precepts being beyond the reach of modern materialistic thought. The Chaldean philosophers are accused, together with the ignorant masses, of Sabaeanism and sun worship. There was a vast difference between the true worship taught to those who showed themselves worthy and the state religions. The Magians are accused of all kinds of superstition, but this is what a Chaldean oracle says. The wide, aerial flights of birds is not true, nor the dissections of the entrails of victims. They are all mere toys, the basis of mercenary fraud. Flee from these. If you would open the sacred paradise of piety, where wisdom, virtue, wisdom, and equity are assembled. Surely it is not those who warn people against mercenary fraud who can be accused of it. If they are accomplished acts which seem miraculous, who can with fairness presume to deny that it was done merely because they possessed a knowledge of natural philosophy and psychological science to a degree unknown to our schools? What did they not know? It is a well-demonstrated fact that the true meridian was correctly ascertained before the first pyramid was built. They had clocks and dials to measure time. Their cubit was established unit of linear measure, being 1,707 feet of English measure. According to Herodotus, the unit of weight was also known. As money, they had gold and silver rings valued by weight. They had the decimal and duodecimal modes of calculation from the earliest times, and were proficient in algebra. How could they otherwise, says an unknown author, bring into operation such immense mechanical powers if they had not thoroughly understood the philosophy of what we term the mechanical powers? The art of making linen and fine fabrics is also proved to have been one of their branches of knowledge, for the Bible speaks of it. Joseph was presented by Pharaoh with a vesture of fine linen, a gold chain, and many more things. The linen of Egypt was famous throughout the world. The mummies are all wrapped in it, and the linen is beautifully preserved. Pliny speaks of a certain garment sent 600 years B.C. by King Amasis to Lindus, every single thread of which was composed of 360 minor threads, twisted together. Herodotus gives us, in Book 1, in his account of Isis and the mysteries performed in her honor, an idea of the beauty and admirable softness of the linen worn by the priests. The latter wore shoes made of papyrus and garments of fine linen, because this goddess first taught the use of it, and thus, besides being called Isixi, the priest of Isis, they were also known as Linigera, or the linen wearing. This linen was spun and dyed in those brilliant and gorgeous colors, the secret of which is, likewise, now among the lost arts. On the mummies, we often find the most beautiful embroidery and beadwork ornamenting their shirts. Several of such can be seen in the Museum of Bulaq, Cairo, and are unsurpassable in beauty. The designs are exquisite, and the labor seems immense. The elaborate and much vaunted Gobelins tapestry is but a gross production when compared to some of the embroidery of the ancient Egyptians. We have but to refer to Exodus to discover how skillful was the workmanship of the Israelitish pupils of the Egyptians upon their tabernacle and sacred ark. The sacerdotal vestments and their decorations of pomegranates and golden bells, and the thummim, or jeweled breastplate of the high priest, are described by Josephus as being of unparalleled beauty and of wonderful workmanship. And yet we find beyond doubt that the Jews adopted their rites and ceremonies, and even the special dress of their Levites, from the Egyptians. Clemens Alexandrius acknowledges it very reluctantly, and so does Origen and other fathers of the Church, some of whom, as a matter of course, attribute the coincidence to a clever trick of Satan in anticipation of events. See that self-insertion? Proctor, the astronomer, says in one of his books, "The remarkable breastplate worn by the Jewish high priest was derived directly from the Egyptians. The word thummim itself is evidently of Egyptian origin, borrowed by Moses, like the rest." For further on the same page, Mr. Proctor says that, "In the often repeated picture of judgment of the deceased Egyptian is seen conducted by the god Horus, while Anubis places on one of the balances a vase supposed to contain his good action, and in the other is the emblem of truth, a representation of Themi, the goddess of truth, which was also worn on the judicial breastplate." Wilkinson, in his Manners and Customs of the Ancient Egyptians, shows that the Hebrew thummim is a plural of the word theme. All the ornamental arts seem to have been known to the Egyptians. Their jewelry of gold, silver, and precious stones are beautifully wrought. So is the cutting, polishing, and setting of them executed by the lapidaries in the finest style. The finger ring of the Egyptian mummy, if we remember aright, was pronounced the most artistic piece of jewelry in the London exhibition of 1851. Their imitation of precious stones and glass is far above anything done at the present day, and the emerald may be said to have been imitated to perfection. In Pompeii, says Wendell Phillips, they discovered a room full of glass. There was ground glass, window glass, cut glass, and colored glass of every variety. Catholic priests who broke into China 200 years ago were shown a glass, transparent and colorless, which was filled with liquor made by the Chinese, and which appeared to be colorless like water. This liquor was poured into the glass, and then looking through, it seemed to be filled with fishes. They turned it out and repeated the experiment, and again it was filled with fishes. In Rome they show a bit of glass, a transparent glass, which they light up so as to show you that there is nothing concealed. But in the center of the glass is a drop of colored glass, perhaps as large as a pea, mottled like a duck, and even which even a miniature pencil could not do more perfectly. It is manifest that this drop of liquid glass must have been poured, because there is no joint. This must have been done by a greater heat than the annealing process, because that process shows breaks. In relation to their wonderful art of imitating precious stones, the lecturer speaks of the celebrated vase of the Genoa Cathedral, which was considered for long centuries a solid emerald. The Roman Catholic legend of it was that it was one of the treasures that the Queen of Sheba gave to Solomon, and that it was the identical cup out of which the Saviour drank at the Last Supper. Subsequently, it was found not to be an emerald, but an imitation, and when Napoleon brought it to Paris and gave it to the Institute, the scientists were obliged to confess that it was not a stone, and that they could not tell what it was. Further, when speaking of the skill of the ancients in metalworks, the same lecturer narrates that, when the English plundered the summer palace of the Emperor of China, the European artist was surprised at seeing the curiously wrought metal vessels of every kind, far exceeding all the boasted skill of the workmen of Europe. African tribes in the interior of the country gave travelers better razors than they had. George Thompson told me, he adds, he saw a man in Calcutta throw a handful of floss silk in the air, and a Hindu sever it into pieces with his saber of native steel. He concludes the apt remark that the steel is the greatest triumph of metallurgy, and metallurgy is the glory of chemistry. So with the ancient Egyptians and Semitic races. They dug gold and separated it with the utmost skill. Copper, lead, and iron were found in abundance near the Red Sea. In a lecture delivered in 1873 on the cavemen of Devonshire, Mr. W. Pengilly, F.R.S., stated on the authority of some Egyptologists that the first iron used in Egypt was meteoric iron. As the earliest mention of this metal is found in the Egyptian document, in which it is called the stone from heaven. This would imply the idea that the only iron which was in use in the days of old was a meteorite. This may have been the case at the commencement of the period embraced by our present geological explorations, but till we can compute with the least approximate accuracy the age of our excavated relics, who can tell but that we are making a blunder of possibly several 100,000 years? The injudiciousness of dogmatizing upon what the ancient Chaldeans and Egyptians did not know about mining and metallurgy is at least partially shown by the discoveries of Colonel Howard Weiss. Moreover, many of such precious stones as are only found at great depths in mines are mentioned in Homer and the Hebrew Scriptures. Have scientists ascertained the precise time when mining shafts were first sunk by mankind? According to Dr. A.C. Hamlin, in India, the arts of the goldsmith and lapidary are practiced from an unknown antiquity, that the Egyptians either knew from the remotest ages how to temper steel, or possessed something still better and more perfect than the implement necessary in our days for chiseling, is an alternative from which the archaeologist cannot escape. How else could they have produced such artistic chiseling or wrought the sculpture as they did? The critics may take their choice of either, according to them, steel tools of the most exquisite temper, or some other means of cutting syenite, granite, and basalt, which, in the latter case, must be added to the long catalogue of lost arts. Professor Albrecht Müller says, "We may ascribe to the introduction of bronze manufacture into Europe to a great race immigrant from Asia some 6,000 years ago, called Aryas, or Aryans. Civilization of the East preceded that of the West by many centuries. There are many proofs that a considerable degree of culture existed at its very beginning. Bronze was yet in use, but iron as well. Pottery was not only shaped on the lathe, but burned a good red. Manufactures in glass, gold, and silver are found for the first time. In lonely mountain places are yet found dross, and the remains of iron furnaces. To be sure, this dross is sometimes ascribed to volcanic action, but it is met with where volcanoes could never have existed. But it is in the process of preparing mummies that the skill of this wonderful people is exemplified in the highest degree. None but those who have made a special study of the subject can estimate the amount of skill, patience, and knowledge exacted for the accomplishment of this indestructible work, which occupied several months. Both chemistry and surgery were called into requisition. The mummies, if left in the dry climate of Egypt, seem to be practically imperishable, and even when removed after a repose of several thousand years, show no signs of change. The body, says that anonymous writer, was filled with myrrh, cassia, and other gums, and after that saturated with natron. Then followed the marvelous swathing of the emballed body, so artistically executed that professional modern bandologists are lost in admiration at its excellency, says Dr. Granville. There is not a single form of bandage known to modern surgery, of which far better and cleverer examples are not seen in the swathings of the Egyptian mummies. The strips of linen are found without one single joint, extending to 1,000 yards in length. Rossellini, in Kenrick's Ancient Egypt, gives a similar testimony to the wonderful variety and skill with which the bandages have been applied and interlaced. There was not a fracture in the human body that could not be repaired successfully by the sacerdotal physician of those remote days. Who but well remembers the excitement produced some 25 years ago by the discovery of anesthesia? The nitrous oxide gas, sulfuric and chloric ether, chloroform, laughing gas, besides various other combinations of these, were welcomed as so many heavenly blessings to the suffering portion of humanity. Poor Dr. Horace Wells of Hartford in 1844 was the discoverer, and Doctors Morton and Jackson reaped the honors and benefits in 1846, as is usual in such cases. The anesthetics were proclaimed the greatest discovery ever made, and though the famous lithium of Morton and Jackson, a compound of sulfuric ether, the chloroform of Sir James Y. Simpson, and the nitrous oxide gas introduced by Colton in 1843 and by Dunham and Smith, were occasionally checked by fatal cases, it still did not prevent these gentlemen from being considered public benefactors. The patients, successfully put to sleep, sometimes awoke no more. What matters that, so long as others were relieved? Physicians assure us that accidents are now but rarely apprehended. Perhaps it is because the beneficent and the anesthetic agents are so parsimoniously applied as to fail in their effects one half of the time, leaving the sufferer paralyzed for a few seconds in his external movements, but feeling the pain as acutely as ever. On the whole, however, chloroform and laughing gas are beneficent discoveries. But are they the first anesthetics ever discovered? Strictly speaking, Dioscoride speaks of the stone of Memphis, Lapis Memphiticus, and describes it as a small pebble, round, polished, and very sparkling. When ground into powder and applied as an ointment to that part of the body on which the surgeon was about to operate, either with his scalpel or fire, it preserved that part, and only that part, from any pain in the operation. In the meantime, it was perfectly harmless to the constitution of the patient, who retained his consciousness throughout, and in no way dangerous from its effects, and acted so long as it was kept on the affected part. When taken in a mixture of wine and water, all feeling of suffering was perfectly deadened. Pliny also gives a full description of it. From time immemorial, the Brahmins have had in their possession secrets quite as valuable. The widow, bent on the self-sacrifice of concremation, called Sahamaranyana, has no dread of suffering the least pain, for the fiercest flames will consume her, without one pang of agony being experienced by her. The holy plants which crown her brow, as she is conducted in ceremony to the funeral pile, the sacred root culled at the midnight hour on the spot where the Ganges and the Yuma mingle their waters, and the process of anointing the body of the self-appointed victim with ghee and sacred oils, after she is bathed in all her clothes and finery, are so many magical anesthetics. Supported by those she is going to part with in body, she walks thrice around her fiery couch, and, after bidding them farewell, is cast on the dead body of her husband, and leaves this world without a single moment of suffering. The semi-fluid, says a missionary writer, an eyewitness of several such ceremonies, the ghee is poured upon the pile, it is instantly inflamed, and the drugged widow dies quickly of suffocation before the fire reaches her body. No such thing, if the ceremony is only conducted strictly after the prescribed rites. The widows are never drugged in the sense we are accustomed to understand the word. Only precautionary measures are taken against a useless physical martyrdom, the atrocious agony of burning. Her mind is as free and clear as ever, and even more so. Firmly believing in the promise of a future life, her whole mind is absorbed in the contemplation of the approaching bliss, the beatitude of freedom, which she is about to obtain. She generally dies with the smile of heavenly rapture on her countenance, and if someone is to suffer at the hour of retribution, it is not the earnest devotee of her faith, but the crafty Brahmins who know well enough that no such ferocious rite was ever prescribed. As to the victim, after having been consumed, she becomes a sati, transcendent purity, and is canonized after death. Egypt is the birthplace and the cradle of chemistry. Kendrick shows that the root of the word to be Kimai, or Kim, which was the name of the country. Psalms 27. The chemistry of colors seemed to have been thoroughly well known in that country. Facts are facts. Where among our painters are we to search for the artist who can decorate our walls with imperishable colors? Ages after our pygmy buildings will have crumbled into dust, and the cities enclosing them will themselves have become shapeless heaps of brick and mortar with forgotten names. Long after that will the halls of Karnak and Luxor still be standing, and the gorgeous mural paintings of the latter will doubtless be as bright and vivid 4,000 years hence as they were 4,000 years ago and are today. Embalming and fresco painting, says our author, was not a chance discovery with the Egyptians, but brought out from definitions and maxims, like any induction of Faraday. Our modern Italians boast of their Etruscan vases and paintings. The decorative borders found on Greek vases provoke the admiration of the lovers of antiquity, and are ascribed to the Greeks, while in fact they were but copies from the Egyptian vases. Their figures can be found any day on the walls of a tomb, the age of Amunoph I, a period at which Greece was not even in existence. Where, in our age, can we point to anything comparable to the rock temples of Istanbul and Lower Nubia, Istanbul? There may be seen sitting figures 70 feet high, carved out of the living rock. The torso of the statue of Ramses II at Thebes measures 60 feet around the shoulders, and elsewhere in proportion. Besides such titanic sculpture, that our own seems that of pygmies. Iron was known to the Egyptians at least before the construction of the first pyramid, which is over 20,000 years ago, according to Bunsen. The proofs of this had remained hidden for many thousands of years in the pyramid of Cheops, until Colonel Howard Weiss found it in the shape of a piece of iron in one of the joints, where it had evidently been placed at the time this pyramid was first built. Egyptologists adduce many indications that the ancients were perfectly well acquainted with metallurgy in prehistoric times. To this day we can find at Sinai large heaps of scoriae, produced by smelting. Metallurgy and chemistry, as practiced in those days, were known as alchemy, and were at the bottom of prehistoric magic. Moreover, Moses proved his knowledge of alchemical chemistry by pulverizing the golden calf and strewing the powder upon the water. Now, if we turn to navigation, we will find ourselves able to prove on good authorities that Necho II fitted out a fleet on the Red Sea and dispatched it for exploration. The fleet was absent above 2 years, and instead of returning through the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, as was wont, sailed back through the Straits of Gibraltar. Herodotus was not at all swift to concede to the Egyptians a maritime achievement so vast as this. They had, he says, been spreading the report that, returning homewards, they had the sunrise on their right hands, a thing which to me is incredible. And yet, remarks the author of the heretofore mentioned article, this incredible assertion is now proved incontestable, as may well be understood by anyone who has doubled the Cape of Good Hope. Thus, it is proved that the most ancient of these people performed a feat which was attributed to Columbus many ages later. They say they anchored twice on their way, sowed corn, reaped it, and sailing away, steered in triumph through the Pillars of Hercules and eastward along the Mediterranean. There was a people, he adds, much more deserving of the term veteres than the Romans and Greeks. The Greeks, young in their knowledge, sounded the trumpet before these and called upon all the world to admire their ability. Old Egypt, gone grey in her wisdom, was so secure of her acquirements that she did not invite admiration and cared no more for the opinion of the flippant Greek than we do today for that of the Fiji Islander. "O Solon, Solon," says the oldest Egyptian priest to that sage, "you Greeks are ever childish, having no ancient opinion, no discipline of any long standing." And very much surprised, indeed, was the great Solon when he was told by the priest of Egypt that so many gods and goddesses of the Grecian pantheon were but the disguised gods of Egypt. Truly spoke Zonaras, "All these things came to us from Chaldea to Egypt, and from thence were derived to the Greeks." Sir David Brewster gives a glowing description of several automata, and the 18th century takes pride in the masterpiece of mechanical art, the flute player of Vulcanson. The little we can glean of positive information on that subject from ancient writers warrants the belief that the learned mechanicians in the day of Archimedes, and some of them much inferior to the great Syracusian, were in no wise more ignorant or less ingenious than our modern inventors. Archeatus, a native of Tarentum in Italy, the instructor of Plato, a philosopher distinguished for his mathematical achievements and wonderful discoveries in practical mechanics, constructed a wooden dove. It must have been an extraordinarily ingenious mechanism, as it flew, fluttered its wings, and sustained itself for a considerable time in the air. This skillful man, who lived 400 years B.C., invented besides the wooden dove, the screw, the crane, and various hydraulic machines. Egypt pressed her own grapes and made wine. Nothing remarkable in that, but she brewed her own beer, and in great quantity. Our Egyptologist goes on to say, the Ebers manuscript proves, now, beyond doubt, that the Egyptians used beer 2,000 years B.C. Sorry. Their beer must have been strong and excellent, like everything they did. Glass was manufactured in all its varieties. In many of the Egyptian sculptures, we find scenes of glass blowing and bottles. Occasionally, during archaeological researches, glasses and glassware are found, and very beautiful they seem to have been. Sir Gardner Wilkinson says that the Egyptians cut, ground, and engraved glass, and possessed the art of introducing gold between the two surfaces of the substance. They imitated with glass, pearls, emeralds, and all the precious stones to a great perfection. Likewise, the most ancient Egyptians cultivated the musical arts and understood well the effects of musical harmony and its influence on the human spirit. We can find on the oldest sculptures and carvings scenes in which the musicians play on various instruments. Music was used in the healing department of the temples for the cure of nervous disorders. We discover on many monuments men playing in bands in concert, the leader beating time by clapping his hands. Thus far we can prove that they understood the laws of harmony. They had their sacred music, domestic and military. The lyre, harp, and flute were used for the sacred concerts. For festive occasions they had the guitar, the single and double pipes, and castanets. For troops and during military service, they had trumpets, tambourines, drums, and cymbals. Various kinds of harps were invented by them, such as the lyre, sambuc, and shore. Some of these had upward of 20 strings. The superiority of the Egyptian lyre over the Grecian is an admitted fact. The material out of which they were made, such instruments, was often very costly and rare wood, and they were beautifully carved. They imported it sometimes from very distant countries. Some were painted, inlaid with mother of pearl, and ornamented with colored leather. They used catgut for strings as we do. Pythagoras learned music in Egypt and made a regular science of it in Italy. But the Egyptians were generally considered, in antiquity, as the best music teachers in Greece. They understood thoroughly how to extract harmonious sounds out of an instrument by adding strings to it, as well as the multiplication of notes by shortening the strings upon its neck, which knowledge shows a great progress in the musical art. Speaking of harps, at a tomb in Thebes, Bruce remarks that they overturn all the accounts hitherto giving of the earliest state of music and musical instruments in the East, and are, altogether, in their form, ornaments, and compass, an incontestable proof, stronger than 1,000 Greek quotations, that geometry, drawing, mechanics, and music were at the greatest perfection when these instruments were made, and that the period from which we date the invention of these arts was only the beginning of the era of their restoration. On the walls of the palace of Ameneph II at Thebes, the king is represented as playing chess with the queen. The monarch reigned long before the Trojan War. In India, the game is known to have been played at least 5,000 years ago. As to their knowledge in medicine, now that one of the lost books of Hermes has been found and translated by Ebers, the Egyptians can speak for themselves. That they understood about the circulation of the blood appears certain from the healing manipulations of the priest, who knew how to draw blood downward, stop its circulation for a while, etc. A more careful study of their bas-reliefs, representing scenes taking place in the healing hall of various temples, will easily demonstrate it. They had their dentists and occultists, oculists, and no doctor was allowed to practice more than one specialty, which certainly warrants the belief that they lost fewer patients in those days than our physicians do now. It is also asserted by some authorities that the Egyptians were the first people in the world who introduced trial by jury, although we doubt this ourselves. But the Egyptians were not the only people of remote epochs whose achievements placed them in so commanding a position before the view of posterity. Besides others whose history is at present shut in behind the mist of antiquity, such as the prehistoric races of the two Americas, of Crete, of the Troad, of the Lacustrians, of the submerged continent of the fabled Atlantis, now classed with myths. The deeds of the Phoenicians stamped them with almost the character of demigods. The writer, in the National Quarterly Review, previously quoted, says that the Phoenicians were the earliest navigators of the world, founded most of the colonies of the Mediterranean, and voyaged to whatever other regions were inhabited. They visited the Arctic regions, whence they brought accounts of eternal days without a night, which Homer has preserved for us in the Odyssey. From the British Isles they imported tin into Africa, and Spain was a favorite site for their colonies. The description of Charybdis so completely answers to the maelstrom that, as this writer says, it is difficult to imagine it to have had any other prototype. Their explorations, it seems, extended in every direction, their sails whitening the Indian Ocean as well as the Norwegian fjords. Different writers have accorded to them the settlement of remote localities, while the entire southern coast of the Mediterranean was occupied by their cities. A large portion of the African territory is asserted to have been peopled by the races expelled by Joshua and the children of Israel. At the time when Procopius wrote, columns stood in Mauritania Tingitania, which bore the inscription, in Phoenician characters, "We are those who fled before the brigand, Joshua, the son of Nun, or Knave." Some suppose these hardy navigators of Arctic and Antarctic waters to have been the progenitors of the races which built the temples and palaces of Palenque and Uxmal, of Copan and Arica. Bressour de Bourbourg gives us much information about the manners and customs, architecture and arts, and especially of the magic and magicians of the ancient Mexicans. He tells us that Wotan, their fabulous hero and the greatest of their magicians, returning from a long voyage, visited King Solomon at the time of the building of the temple. This Wotan appears to be identical with the dreaded Quetzalcoatl, who appears in all the Mexican legends, and, curiously enough, these legends bear a striking resemblance, insomuch as they relate to the voyages and exploits of the Hittim, with the Hebrew Bible account of the Hivites, the descendants of Heth, son of Canaan. The records tell us that Wotan furnished to Solomon the most valuable particulars as to the men, animals, and plants, the gold and precious woods of the Occident, but refused, point blank, to afford any clue to the route he sailed, or the manner of reaching the mysterious continent. Solomon himself gives an account of this interview in his History of the Wonders of the Universe, the chief Votan figuring under the allegory of the navigating serpent. Stephens, indulging in the anticipation that the key surer than that of the Rosetta Stone will be discovered, by which the American hieroglyphs may be read, says that the descendants of the Caciques and the Aztec subjects are believed to survive still in the inaccessible fastness of the Cordilleras, wildernesses which have never been penetrated by a white man, living, as their fathers did, erecting the same buildings, with the ornaments of sculptured and plastered, large courts and lofty towers with high ranges of steps, and still carving on tablets of stone the same mysterious hieroglyphics. He adds, I turn to that vast and unknown region, untraversed by a single road, where fancy pictures that mysterious city seen from the topmost range of the Cordilleras, of unconquered, unvisited, and unsought aboriginal inhabitants. Apart from the fact that this mysterious city has been seen from a great distance by daring travelers, there is no intrinsic improbability of its existence. For who can tell what became of the primitive people who fled before the rapacious brigands of Cortez and Pizarro? Dr. Tschudi, in his works on Peru, tells us of an Indian legend that a train of 10,000 llamas, laden with gold to complete the unfortunate Inca's ransom, was arrested in the Andes by the tidings of his death, and the enormous treasure was so effectually concealed that not a trace of it has ever been found. He, as well as Prescott and other writers, informs us that the Indians, to this day, preserve their ancient traditions, and sacerdotal caste, and obey implicitly the orders of rulers chosen among themselves, while at the same time nominally Catholics and actually subject to Peruvian authorities. Magical ceremonies practiced by their forefathers still prevail among them, and magical phenomena occur. So persistent are they in their loyalty to the past that it seems impossible but they should be in relations with some central source of authority which constantly supports and strengthens their faith, keeping it alive. May it not be that the source of this undying faith lay in this mysterious city with which they are in secret communication? Or must we think that all of the above is again but a curious coincidence? The story of this mysterious city was told to Stephens by a Spanish padre in 1838 or 9. The priest swore to him that he had seen it with his own eyes, and gave Stephens the following details, which the traveler firmly believed to be true. The padre of the little village near the ruins of Santa Cruz del Quiche had heard of the unknown city at the village of Chacul. He was then young, and climbed with much labor to the naked summit of the topmost ridge of the Sierra of the Cordillera. When arrived at the height of 10 or 12,000 feet, he looked over an immense plain, extending to Yucatan and the Gulf of Mexico, and saw, at a great distance, a large city spread over a great space, with turrets white and glittering in the sun. Tradition says that no white man has ever reached this city, that the inhabitants speak the Maya language, know that strangers have conquered their whole land, and murder any white man who attempts to enter their territory. They have no coin, no horses, cattle, or mules, or other domestic animals except fowls, and the cocks they keep underground to prevent their crowing being heard. Nearly the same was given to us personally about 20 years ago by an old native priest, whom we met in Peru, and with whom we happened to have business relations. He had passed all his life vainly trying to conceal his hatred towards the conquerors. Brigands, he termed them, and, as he confessed, kept friends with them in the Catholic religion for the sake of his people. But he was as truly a sun-worshipper in his heart as he ever was. He had traveled in his capacity of a converted native missionary, and had been at Santa Cruz, and, as he solemnly affirmed, had also been to see some of his people by a subterranean passage leading into the mysterious city. We believe his account, for a man who is about to die will rarely stop to invent idle stories, and this one we have found corroborated in Stephen's travels. Besides, we know of 2 other cities utterly unknown to European travelers, not that the inhabitants particularly desire to hide themselves, for people from Buddhistic countries come occasionally to visit them, but their towns are not set down on the European or Asiatic maps, and on account of the too zealous and enterprising Christian missionaries, and perhaps for more mysterious reasons of their own, the few natives of other countries who are aware of the existence of these 2 cities never mention them. Nature has provided strange nooks and hiding places for her favorites, and, unfortunately, it is but far away from so-called civilized countries that man is free to worship the deity in the way that his fathers did. Even the erudite and sober Max Muller is somehow unable to get rid of the coincidences. To him they come in the shape of the most unexpected discoveries. These Mexicans, for instance, whose obscure origin, according to the laws of probability, has no connection with the Aryans of India, nevertheless, like the Hindus, represent an eclipse of the moon as the moon being devoured by a dragon. And though Professor Muller admits that an historical intercourse between the 2 peoples was suspected by Alexander von Humboldt, and he himself considers it possible, still the occurrence of such a fact, he adds, need not be the result of any historical intercourse. As we have stated above, the origin of the aborigines of America is a very vexed question for those interested in tracing out the affiliation and migrations of peoples. Notwithstanding the labor of Brasseur de Bourbourg in his elaborate translation of the famous Popol Vuh, alleged to be written by, I'm not going to try it, after weighing its contents, the antiquarian remains as much in the dark as ever. We have read the Popol Vuh in its original translation, and the review of the same by Max Muller, and out of the former find shining a light of such brightness that it is no wonder that the matter-of-fact, skeptical scientist should be blinded by it. But so far as an author can be judged by his writings, Professor Max Muller is no unfair skeptic, and moreover, very little of importance escapes his attention. How is it then that a man of such immense and rare erudition, accustomed as he is to embrace at one eagle glance the traditions, religious customs, and superstitions of a people, detecting the slightest similarity and taking in the smallest details, fail to give any importance, or perhaps even suspect, what the humble author of the present volume, who has neither scientific training nor erudition to any extent, apprehended at first view? Fallacious and unwarranted as to many may seem this remark, it appears to us that science loses more than she gains by neglecting the ancient and even medieval esoteric literature, or rather what remains of it. To one who devotes himself to such study, many a coincidence is transformed into a natural result of demonstrable antecedent causes. We think we can see how it is that Professor Muller confesses that now and then one imagines one sees certain periods and landmarks, but in the next page all is chaos again. May it not be barely possible that this chaos is intensified by the fact that most of the scientists, directing the whole of their attention to history, skip that which they treat as vague, contradictory, miraculous, absurd, notwithstanding the feeling that there was a groundwork of noble conceptions which has been covered and distorted by an aftergrowth of fantastic nonsense. Professor Muller cannot help comparing this nonsense to the tales of Arabian Nights. Far be it from us the ridiculous pretension of criticizing a scientist so worthy of admiration for his learning as Max Muller. But we cannot help saying that even among the fantastic nonsense of Arabian Nights entertainments, anything would be worthy of attention if it should help us towards the evolving of some historical truth. Homer's Odyssey surpasses in fantastic nonsense all the tales of the Arabian Nights combined, And, notwithstanding that, many of his myths are now proved to be something else besides the creation of an old poet's fancy. The Laestrygonians, who devoured the companions of Ulysses, are traced to the huge cannibal race said in primitive days to inhabit the caves of Norway. Geology verified through her discoveries some of the assertions of Homer, supposed for so many ages to have been but poetical hallucinations. The perpetual daylight enjoyed by this race of Laestrygonians indicates that they were inhabitants of the North Cape, where, during the whole summer, there is perpetual daylight. The Norwegian fords are perfectly described by Homer in his Odyssey, and the gigantic stature of the Laestrygonians is demonstrated by human bones of unusual size found in caves situated near this region, and which geologists suppose to have belonged to a race extinct long before the Aryan immigration. Carbitis, as we have seen, has been recognized in the maelstrom, and the wandering rocks in the enormous icebergs of the Arctic seas. If the consecutive attempts at the creation of man described in the cosmogony suggest no comparison with some apocrypha, with the Jewish sacred books, and with the Kabbalistic theories of creation, it is indeed strange. Even the Book of Jasher, condemned as a gross forgery of the 12th century, may furnish more than one clue to trace a relation between the population of of the Chaldeans, where the Magism flourished in the days of Abraham, and those of Central and North America. The divine beings, being brought down to the level of human nature, performed no feats or tricks more strange or incredible than the miraculous performances of Moses and of Pharaoh's magicians. While many of these are exactly similar in their nature, and when, moreover, in addition to this later fact, we find so great a resemblance between certain Kabbalistic terms common to both hemispheres, there must be something else than mere accident to account for the circumstances. Many of such feats have clearly a common parentage, the story of the two brothers of Central America, who, before starting on their journey to Zabawa, plant each a cane in the middle of their grandmother's house, that she may know by its flourishing or withering whether they are alive or dead, finds its analogy in the beliefs of many other countries. In the popular tales and traditions by Sakharov, one can find a similar narrative, and trace this belief in various other legends. And yet these fairy tales were current in Russia many centuries before America was discovered. In recognizing in the gods of Stonehenge the divinities of Delphos and Babylon, one need feel little surprised. Bel and the dragon, Apollo and Python, Osiris and Typhon are all one under many names and have traveled far and wide. The Bothel of Ireland points directly to its first parent, the Batelos of the Greeks and Bethel of Canaan. History, says H.D. de Villemark, which took no notes at those distant ages, can plead ignorance, but the science of language affirms. Philology, with a daily increasing probability, has again linked together the chain hardly broken between the Orient and the Occident. No more remarkable is the discovery of a like resemblance between the Oriental myths and ancient Russian tales and traditions, for it is entirely natural to look for a similarity between the beliefs of the Semitic and Aryan families. But when we discover an almost perfect identity between the character of Zeravina Milistrissa, with a moon in her forehead, who is in constant danger of being devoured by Zmei Gornich, the serpent or dragon, who plays such a prominent part in all popular Russian tales, and similar tales in the Mexican legends, extending to the minutest details, we may well pause and ask ourselves whether there be not here more than a simple coincidence. This tradition of the dragon and sun, occasionally replaced by the moon, has awakened echoes in the remotest parts of the world. It may be accounted for with perfect readiness by the once universal heliolatros religion. There was a time when Asia, Europe, Africa, and America were covered with the temples sacred to the sun and the dragons. The priests assumed the names of their deities, and thus the tradition of these spread like a network all over the globe. Bel and the dragon being uniformly coupled together, and the priests of the Ophite religion as uniformly assuming the name of his god. But still, if the original conception is natural and intelligible, and its occurrence need not be the result of any historical intercourse, as Professor Muller tells us, the details are so strikingly similar that we cannot feel satisfied that the riddle is entirely solved. The origin of this universal symbolical worship is being concealed in the night of time. We would have a far more chance to arrive at the truth by tracing these traditions to their very source. And where is this source? Kircher places the origin of the Ophite and Heliolatros worship, the shape of conical monuments and the obelisk, with the Egyptian Hermes Trismegistus. Where, then, except in Hermetic books, are we to seek for the desired information? It is likely that modern authors can know more, or as much, of ancient myths and cults as the men who taught them to their contemporaries. Clearly, two things are necessary. First, to find the missing books of Hermes, and second, the key by which to understand them, for reading is not sufficient. Failing in this, our savants are abandoned to unfruitful speculations, for, as for a like reason, geographers waste their energies in a vain quest of the sources of the Nile. Truly, the land of Egypt is another abode of mystery. Without stopping to discuss whether Hermes was the prince of post-diluvian magic, as Dumosu calls him, or the antediluvian, which is much more likely, one thing is certain. The authenticity, reliability, and usefulness of the books of Hermes, or rather what remains of the 36 works attributed to the Egyptian magician, are fully recognized by Champollion, Jr., and corroborated by Champollion Figeac, who mentions it. Now, if carefully looking over the Kabbalistic works, which are all derived from that universal storehouse of esoteric knowledge, we find the facsimiles of many so-called miracles wrought by magical art, equally reproduced by the quiches, and if, even in the fragments left of the original Popol Vuh, there is sufficient evidence that the religious customs of the Mexicans, Peruvians, and other American races are nearly identical with those of the ancient Phoenicians, Babylonians, and Egyptians. And if, moreover, we discover that many of their religious terms have etymologically the same origin, how are we to avoid believing that they are the descendants of those forefathers? Fled before the brigand, Yeshua, the son of Nun. Nunez de la Vega says that Nin, or Immos, of the Tzindels, were the Ninus of the Babylonians. It is possible that, so far, it may be a coincidence, as the identification of one and the other rests upon a poor argument. But it is known, adds de Bourbourg, that this prince, and according to others his father, Bel, or Baal, received, like the Nen of the Tzindelles, the homages of his subjects under the shape of a serpent. The latter assertion, besides being fantastic, is nowhere corroborated in the Babylonian records. It is very true that the Phoenicians represented the sun under the image of a dragon, but so did all the other people who symbolized their sun gods. Belus, the first king of the Assyrian dynasty, was, according to Castor, and Eusebius, who quotes him, deified. In example, he was ranked among the gods after his death only. Thus, neither himself nor his son, Ninus or Nin, could have received their subjects under the shape of a serpent, whatever the Tzindales did. Bel, according to Christians, is Baal, and Baal is the devil. That's who Moses had opened the sea, was Baal. Since the Bible prophets began so designating every deity of their neighbors before Belus, Ninus, and the Mexican Nin are serpents and devils, and as the devil, or father of evil, is one under many forms, therefore, under whatever name the serpent appears, it is the devil. Strange logic. Why not say that Ninus, the Assyrian, represented as husband and victim of the ambitious Semiramis, was high priest as well as king of his country? That as such he wore on his tiara the sacred emblems of the dragon and the sun. Moreover, as the priest generally assumed the name of his god, Ninus was said to receive his subject as the representative of this serpent god. The idea is preeminently Roman Catholic and amounts to very little, as all their inventions do. If Nunez de la Vega was so anxious to establish an affiliation between the Mexicans and the biblical sun and serpent worshippers, why did he not show another and better similarity between them without tracing in the Ninevites and the Zendalis the hoof and horn of the Christian devil? And to begin with, he might have pointed to the Chronicles of Fuentes of the Kingdom of Guatemala, to the manuscript of Don Juan Torres, the grandson of the last king of the Quiches. This document, which is said to have been in the possession of the lieutenant general appointed by Pedro de Alvarado, states that the Toltecas themselves descended from the house of Israel, who were released by Moses, and who, after crossing the Red Sea, fell into idolatry. After that, having separated themselves from their companions, and under the guise of a chief named Tanub, they set out wandering from one continent to another. They came to a place called the Seven Caverns, in the Kingdom of Mexico, where they founded the famous town of Tula, etc. If this statement has never obtained more credit than it has, it is simply due to the fact that it passed through the hands of Father Francis Vasquez, historian of the Order of St. Francis, and this circumstance, to use the expression employed by de Mussou, in connection with the work of the poor, unfrocked Abbe Huc, is not calculated to strengthen our confidence. But there is another point as important, if not more so, as it seems to have escaped falsification by the zealous Catholic padres, and rests chiefly on Indian tradition. A famous Toltecan king, whose name is mixed up in the weird legends of Utatlan, the ruined capital of the great Indian kingdom, bore the biblical application of Balaam Akan, the first name being preeminently Chaldean, and reminded one immediately of Balaam and his human-voiced ass. Besides the statement of Lord Kingsborough, who found such a striking similarity between the language of the Aztecs, the mother tongue, and the Hebrew, many of the figures on the bas-relief of Palenque and idols in terracotta exhumed in Santa Cruz del Quiche have on their heads bandolets with a square protuberance on them, in front of the forehead, very similar to the phylacteries worn by the Hebrew Pharisees of old, while at prayers, and even by devotees of the present day, particularly the Jews of Poland and Russia. But, as this may be but a fancy of ours after all, we will not insist on the details. Upon the testimony of the ancients, corroborated by modern discoveries, we know that there were numerous catacombs in Egypt and Chaldea, some of them very vast extent. The most renowned of them were the subterranean crypts of Thebes and Memphis. The former, beginning on the western side of the Nile, extended towards the Libyan desert and were known as the Serpent's Catacombs, or passages. It was there that would perform the sacred mysteries of the Cuculus Anglices, the unavoidable cycle, more generally known as the circle of necessity, the inexorable doom imposed upon every soul after the bodily death, and when it had been judged in the Amethinian region. In de Boerbourg's book, Wotan, the Mexican demigod, in narrating his expedition, describes a subterranean passage which ran underground and terminated at the root of the heavens, adding that this passage was a snake's hole, un agujero de culebra, and that he was admitted to it because he was himself a son of the snakes, or a serpent. This is, indeed, very suggestive, for his description of the snake's hole is that of the ancient Egyptian crypt as above mentioned. The hierophants, moreover, of Egypt, as of Babylon, generally style themselves sons of the serpent god or sons of the dragon, and not because, as de Moussu would have his readers believe, they were the progeny of Satan Incubus, the old serpent of Eden, but because in the mysteries the serpent was the symbol of wisdom and immortality. The Assyrian priest bore always the name of his god, said movers. The Druids of the Celto-Britannic regions also called themselves snakes. I am a serpent, I am a Druid, they declared. The Egyptian Karnak is twin brother to the Karnak of Bretagne, the latter Karnak meaning the serpent's mount. The Dractonia once covered the surface of the globe, and these temples were sacred to the dragon only because it was the symbol of the sun, which, in its turn, was the symbol of the highest god, the Phoenician Elon, or Elion, whom Abraham recognized as El Elyon. Besides the surname of serpents, they were called the builders, the architects, for the immense grandeur of their temples and monuments was such that even now the pulverized remains of them frighten the mathematical calculations of our modern engineers, says Taliesin. De Boerbourg hints that the chiefs of the name of Wotan, the Quetzalcoatl, or serpent deity of the Mexicans, are the descendants of Ham and Canaan. I am Hivim, they say. Being a Hivim, I am of the great race of the dragon, snake. I am a snake myself, for I am Hivim. And de Moussu, rejoicing because he believes himself fairly on the serpent's, or rather devil's tail, hurries to explain. According to the most learned commentators of our sacred books, the Kivim, or Hivites, descend from Heth, son of Canaan, son of Ham, the accursed. But modern research has demonstrated, on unimpeachable evidence, that the whole genealogical table of the 10th chapter of Genesis refers to imaginary heroes, and that the closing verses of the 9th are little better than a bit of Chaldean allegory of Sisyphus and the mystical flood, compiled and arranged to fit the Noachian frame. But suppose the descendants of these Canaanites, the accursed, were to resent for once the unmerited outrage. It would be an easy matter for them to reverse the tables and answer to this fling, based on a fable, by a fact, for to be proved by archaeologists and symbologists, namely that Seth, Adam's third son, and the forefather of all Israel, the ancestor of Noah, and the progenitor of the chosen people, is but Hermes, the god of wisdom, also called Teote, Tat, Set, and Sat-An, and that he was, furthermore, when viewed under his bad aspect, Typhon, the Egyptian Satan, who was also Set. For the Jewish people, whose well-educated men, no more than Philo or Josephus, the historian, regard their Mosaic books as otherwise than an allegory, such a discovery amounts to but little. But for Christians, who, like de Moussu, very unwisely accept the Bible narratives as literal history, the case stands very different. As far as affiliation goes, we agree with this pious writer, and we feel every day as certain that some of the peoples of Central America will be traced back to the Phoenicians and the Mosaic Israelites, as we do that the latter will be proved to have as persistently stuck to the same idolatry, if idolatry there is, of the sun and serpent worship, as the Mexicans. See the Unconventional Bible Study. There is evidence, biblical evidence, that two of Jacob's sons, Levi and Dan, as well as Judah, married Canaanite women and followed the worship of their wives. Try Solomon. That's his mom. Of course, every Christian will protest, but the proof may be found even in the translated Bible, pruned as it now stands. The dying Jacob thus describes his sons. Dan, says he, shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path, that biteth the horse heels, so that his rider shall fall backwards. I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord. Of Simeon and Levi, the patriarch, or Israel, remarks that they are brethren, instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly. Now, in the original, the words their secret read their sod, and sod was the name for the great mysteries of Baal, Adonis, and Bacchus, who were all sun gods and had serpents for symbols. The Kabbalists explain the allegory of the fiery serpents by saying that this was the name given to the tribe of Levi, to all the Levites, in short, and that Moses was the chief of the Sodales. And here is the moment to prove our statements. Moses is mentioned by several old historians as an Egyptian priest. Manetho says he was a hierophant of Hierapolis, and a priest of the sun god Osiris, and that his name was Osirisif. These moderns, who accept it as a fact that he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, must also submit to the right interpretation of the word wisdom, which was throughout the world known as a synonym of initiation into the secrets of the Magi. Did the idea never strike the reader of the Bible that an alien, born and brought up in a foreign country, could not and would not possibly have been admitted? We will not say to the final initiation, the grandest mystery of all, but even to share the knowledge of the minor priesthood, those who belong to the lesser mysteries. In Genesis something 32, my Roman numerals are not great, we read that no Egyptian could seat himself to eat bread with the brothers of Joseph, for that is an abomination unto the Egyptians, but that the Egyptians ate with him, Joseph, by themselves. I pointed that out in the Unconventional Bible Study. The above proves two things. One, that Joseph, whatever he was in his heart, had, in appearance at least, changed his religion, married the daughter of a priest of the idolatrous nation, and become himself an Egyptian. Otherwise the natives would not have eaten bread with him. And two, that subsequently Moses, if not an Egyptian by birth, became one through being admitted into the priesthood, and thus was a Sodale. There is an alternative explanation that relies heavily upon Midian, and you should definitely check out the Unconventional Bible Study for more. Again, in Exodus. As an induction, the narrative of the brazen serpent, the caduceus of Mercury or Asclepios, the son of the sun god Apollo Python, becomes logical and natural. If you are unaware that there was, indeed, idolatry involved with the temple, they were worshiping a snake on a stick well into the kingdom. We must bear in mind that Pharaoh's daughter, who saved Moses and adopted him, is called by Josephus Theramutis, and the latter, according to Wilkinson, is the name of the asp, sacred to Isis. Moreover, Moses is said to descend from the tribe of Levi. We will explain the Kabbalistic ideas as to the Book of Moses and the great prophet himself more fully in Volume 2. I am looking forward to that. If Brossour de Broberg and the Chevalier de Moussou had so much at heart to trace the identity of the Mexicans with the Canaanites, they might have found far better and weightier proofs than by showing both the accursed descendants of Ham. For instance, they may have pointed to the Nargal, the Chaldean and Assyrian chief of the Magi, Rab Mag, and the Nagal, the chief sorcerer of the Mexican Indians. Both derive their names from Nergal-Sarazir, the Assyrian god, and both have the same faculties, or powers, to have an attendant demon with whom they identify themselves completely. The Chaldean and Assyrian Nergal kept his demon, in the shape of some animal considered sacred, inside the temple. The Indian Nagal keeps his wherever he can, in the neighboring lake or wood, or in the house under the shape of a household animal. We find the Catholic World newspaper, and in a recent number, bitterly complaining that the old pagan element of the aboriginal inhabitants of America does not seem to be utterly dead in the United States, even where tribes have been for long years under the care of Christian teachers. Heathen rites are practiced in secret, and crypto-paganism, or Nagualism, flourishes now as in the days of Montezuma. It says, Nagualism and voodoo worship, as it calls these two strange sects, are direct devil worship. A report addressed to the Cortes in 1812 by Don Pedro Baptizo Pino says, all the pueblos have their artufas, so the natives call subterranean rooms with only a single door, where they assemble to perform their feast and hold meetings. These are impenetrable temples, and the doors are always closed on the Spaniards. All these pueblos, in spite of the sway of the religion has had over them, cannot forget a part of the beliefs which have been transmitted to them, and which they are careful to transmit to their descendants. Hence come the adoration they render the sun and moon and other heavenly bodies, the respect they entertain for fire, etc. The Pueblo chiefs seem to be at the same time priests. They perform various simple rites by which the power of the sun and of Montezuma is recognized, as well as the power, according to some accounts, of the great snake, to whom, by order of Montezuma, they are to look for life. They also officiate in certain ceremonies with which they pray for rain. There are painted representations of the great snake, together with that of a misshapen, red-haired man, declared to stand in for Montezuma. Of this last, there was also, in the year 1845, in the pueblo of Laguna, a rude effigy or idol, intended, apparently, to represent only the head of the deity. The perfect identity of the rites, ceremonies, traditions, and even the names of the deities among the Mexicans and ancient Babylonians and Egyptians are a sufficient proof of South America being peopled by a colony which mysteriously found its way across the Atlantic. When? At what period? History is silent on that point, but those who consider that there is no tradition, sanctified by ages, without a certain sediment of truth at the bottom of it, believe in the Atlantis legend. There are, scattered throughout the world, a handful of thoughtful and solitary students who pass their lives in obscurity, far from the rumors of the world, studying the great problems of the physical and spiritual universes. They have their secret records in which are preserved the fruits of scholastic labors of the long line of recluses, whose successors they are. The knowledge of their early ancestors, the sages of India, Babylonia, Nineveh, and the imperial Thebes, the legends and traditions commented upon by the masters of Solon, Pythagoras, and Plato, in the marble halls of Heliopolis and Sais, traditions which in their days already seemed to harmlessly glimmer from behind the foggy curtain of the past. All this and much more is recorded on indestructible parchment and passed with jealous care from one adept to another. These men believe in the story of Atlantis to be no fable, but maintain that at different epochs of the past huge islands, and even continents, existed where now there is but a wild taste of waters. In those submerged temples and libraries, the archaeologist would find, could he but explore them, the materials for filling all the gaps that now exist in what we imagine is history. They say that at a remote epoch, a traveler could traverse what is now the Atlantic Ocean, almost the entire distance by land, crossing in boats from one island to another, where narrow straits then existed. Our suspicion as to the relationship of the cisatlantic and transatlantic races is strengthened upon reading about the wonders wrought by Quetzalcoatl, the Mexican magician. His wand must be closely related to the traditional sapphire stick of Moses, the stick which bloomed in the garden of Raguel Jethro, his father-in-law, and upon which was engraved the ineffable name. The four men, described as the real four ancestors of the human race, who were neither begotten by the gods nor born of woman, but whose creation was a wonder wrought by the Creator, and who were made after 3 attempts at manufacturing men had failed, equally present some striking points of similarity with the esoteric explanations of the Hermeticists. They also undeniably recall the 4 sons of God of the Egyptian theogony. Moreover, as any one may infer, the resemblance of this myth to the narrative related in Genesis will be apparent to even a superficial observer. These 4 ancestors could reason and speak, their sight was unlimited, and they knew all things at once. When they had rendered thanks to their Creator for their existence, the gods were frightened, and they breathed a cloud over the eyes of men, that they might see a certain distance only, and not be like gods themselves. This bears directly upon the sentence in Genesis, "Behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil, and now, lest he put forth his hand and also take of the tree of life," etc. Then again, "While they were asleep, God gave them wives," etc. We disclaim the least intention to disrespectfully suggest ideas to those who are so wise as to need no hint. But we must bear in mind that authentic treatises upon ancient magic of Chaldean and Egyptian lore are not scattered about in public libraries and at auction sales. That such exist is nevertheless a fact for many students of the arcane philosophy. Is it not of the greatest importance for every antiquarian to be acquainted, at least superficially, with their contents? The 4 ancestors of the race, adds Max Muller, seem to have had a long life, and when at last they came to die, they disappeared in a mysterious manner, and left to their sons what is called the hidden majesty, which was never to be opened by human hands. What it was, we do not know. There is no relationship between this hidden majesty and the hidden glory of the if there is no relationship between this hidden majesty and the hidden glory of the Chaldean Kabbalah, which, we are told, was left behind him by Enoch when he was translated in such a mysterious way, then we must discredit all circumstantial evidence. But is it not barely possible that these 4 ancestors of the Kish race typify in their esoteric sense the 4 successive progenitors of men, mentioned in Genesis 1, 2, and 4, 6. In the first chapter, the first man is bisexual. Male and female created him, them, and answers to the hermaphrodite deities of the subsequent mythologies. The second, Adam, made out of the dust of the ground, and unisexual, and answering to the sons of God of chapter 6. No, the third, the giants or Nephilim, who were only hinted at in the Bible, but fully explained elsewhere. The fourth, the parents of men whose daughters were fair. Taking the admitted facts that the Mexicans had their magicians from a remote period, that the same remark applies to all the ancient religions of the world, that a strong resemblance prevails not only in the forms of their ceremonial worship, but also in the very names used to designate certain magical implements. And finally, that all other clues, in accordance with scientific deductions, have failed. Some because swallowed up in the bottomless pit of coincidences. Why should we not turn to the greater authorities upon magic, and see whether under this aftergrowth of fantastic nonsense there may not be a deep substratum of truth? Here we are not willing to be misunderstood. We do not send the scientists to the Kabbalah and the Hermetic books to study magic. but to the authorities on magic to discover materials for history and science. We have no idea of incurring the wrathful denunciation of the academicians by an indiscretion like that of poor Demosu when he tried to force them to read his demonological memoir and investigate the devil. The history of Bernal Diaz de Castilla, the follower of Cortes, gives us some idea of the extraordinary refinement and intelligence of the people whom they conquered. But the descriptions are too long to be inserted here. Suffice it to say that the Aztecs appeared in more than one way to have resembled the ancient Egyptians in civilization and refinement. Among both peoples, magic, or the arcane natural philosophy, was cultivated to the highest degree. Add to this that Greece, later the cradle of arts and sciences, and India, cradle of religions, were and are still devoted to its study and practice. And who shall venture to discredit its dignity as a study and its profundity as a science? There never was, nor can there be, more than one universal religion, for there can be but one truth concerning God. Like an immense chain, whose upper end, the alpha, remains invisibly emanating from a deity, in statu abscontio, with every primitive theology, it encircles our globe in every direction. It leaves not even the darkest corner unvisited before the other end, the omega, turns back on its way to be again received where it first emanated. On this divine chain was strung the exoteric symbology of every people. Their variety of form is powerless to affect their substance, and under their diverse ideal types of the universe of matter, symbolizing its vivifying principles, the uncorrupted immaterial image of the spirit of being guided them is the same. So far as human intellect can go in the ideal interpretation of the spiritual universe, its laws and powers, the last word was pronounced ages since. And if the ideas of Plato can be simplified for the sake of easier comprehension, the spirit of their substance can neither be altered nor removed without material damage to the truth. Let human brains submit themselves to torture for thousands of years to come. Let theology perplex faith and mime it with the enforcing of incomprehensible dogmas in metaphysics. And science strengthen skepticism by pulling down the tottering remains of spiritual intuition in mankind, with her demonstrations of its fallibility. Eternal truth can never be destroyed. We find its last possible expression in our human language in the Persian logos, the Hanover, or the living manifested Word of God. The Zoroastrian Enoch Verhi is identical with the Jewish I Am, and the Great Spirit of the poor, untutored Indian, and in the manifested Brahma of the Hindu philosopher. One of the latter, Charaka, a Hindu physician who is said to have lived 5,000 years B.C., in his treatise on the origin of things, called Usa, thus beautifully expresses himself. Our earth is, like all the luminous bodies that surround us, one of the atoms of the immense whole of which we show a slight conception by terming it the infinite. There is but one light and there is but one darkness, says a Siamese proverb. Daemon et deus in versus, the devil in the shadow of God, states the universal Kabbalistic axiom. Could light exist but for primeval darkness? And did not the brilliant, sunny universe first stretch its infant arms from the swaddling bands of dark and dreary chaos? If the Christian fullness of him that filleth all in all is a revelation, then we must admit that, if there is a devil, he must be included in this fullness, and be a part of that which filleth all in all. From time immemorial, the justification of the deity and his separation from the existing evil was attempted, and the object was reached by the old Oriental philosophy in the foundation of the Theodicee. But their metaphysical views on the fallen spirit have never been disfigured by the creation of an anthropomorphic personality of the devil, as was done subsequently by the leading lights of Christian theology. A personal fiend who opposes the deity and impedes progress on its way to perfection is to be sought only on earth amid humanity, not in heaven. Thus is it that all the religious monuments of old, in whatever land and under whatever climate, are the expression of the same identical thoughts, the key to which is in the esoteric doctrine. It would be vain, without studying the latter, to seek to unriddle the mysteries enshrouded for centuries in the temples and ruins of Egypt and Assyria, or those of Central America, British Columbia, and the Nagan Wat of Cambodia. If each of these was built by a different nation, and neither nation had had intercourse with the other for ages, it is also certain that they were all planned and built under the direct supervision of the priests, and the clergy of every nation, though practicing rites and ceremonies which may have differed externally, had evidently been initiated into the same traditional mysteries which were taught all over the world. In order to institute a better comparison between the specimens of prehistoric architecture to be found at the most opposite points of the globe, we have but to point to the grandiose Hindu ruins of Ellora in the Deccan, the Mexican Chichen Itza in Yucatan, and the still grander ruins of Copan in Guatemala. They present such features of resemblance that it seems impossible to escape the conviction that they were built by peoples moved by the same religious ideas, and that had reached an equal level of highest civilization in arts and sciences. There is not, perhaps, on the face of the whole globe, a more imposing mass of ruins than Nagan Wat, the wonder and puzzle of European archaeologists who venture into Siam. And when we say ruins, the expression is hardly correct, for nowhere are there buildings of such tremendous antiquity to be found in a better state of preservation than Nagan Wat and the ruins of Angkor Thom, the great temple. Hidden far away in the province of Siam Reap, eastern Siam, in the midst of the most luxuriant tropical vegetation, surrounded by an almost impenetrable forest of palms, cocoa trees, and betel nut. The general appearance of the wonderful temple is beautiful and romantic, as well as impressive and grand, says Mr. Vincent, a recent traveler. We, whose good fortune it is to live in the 19th century, are accustomed to boast of the perfection and preeminence of our modern civilization, of the grandeur of our attainments in science, art, literature, and whatnot, as compared with those whom we call ancients. But still, we are compelled to admit that they have far excelled our recent endeavors in many things, and notably in the fine arts of painting, architecture, and sculpture. We were but just looking upon a most wonderful example of the two latter, for in style and beauty of architecture, solidity of construction, and magnificent and elaborate carving and sculpture, the great Nagan Wat has no superior, certainly no rival standing at the present day. The first view of the ruins is overwhelming. Thus, the opinion of another traveler is added to that of many preceding ones, including archaeologists and other competent critics who have believed that the ruins of the past Egyptian splendor deserves no higher eulogium than Nagan Wat. According to our plan, we will allow more impartial critics than ourselves to describe the place, since, in a work professedly devoted to a vindication of the ancients, the testimony of so enthusiastic an advocate as the present writer may be questioned. We have nevertheless seen Nagan Wat under exceptionally favorable circumstances, and can, therefore, certify to the general correctness of Mr. Vincent's description. He says, "We entered upon an immense causeway, the stairs of which were flanked with 6 huge griffins, each carved from a single block of stone. The causeway is 725 feet in length, and paved with stones, each of which measures 4 feet in length by 2 in breadth. On either side of it are artificial lakes, fed by springs, and each covering about 5 acres of ground. The outer wall of Nagan Wat, the city of monasteries, is half a mile square, with gateways, which are handsomely carved with figures of gods and dragons. The foundations are 10 feet in height. The entire edifice, including the roof, is of stone, but without cement, and so closely fitting are the joints as even now to be scarcely discernible. The shape of the building is oblong, being 796 feet in length and 588 in width, while the highest central pagoda rises some 250-odd feet above the ground, and 4 others at the angles of the court are each about 150 feet in height. The above underscored lines are suggestive to travelers who have remarked and admired the same wonderful masonwork in the Egyptian remains. If the same workmen did not lay the courses in both countries, we must at least think that the secret of matchless wall building was equally known in the architects of every land. Passing, we ascend a platform and enter the temple itself through a columned portico, a facade of which is beautifully carved in basso-relievo with ancient mythological subjects. From this doorway, on either side, runs a corridor with a double row of columns cut, base and capital, from single blocks, with a double, oval-shaped roof covered with carving and consecutive sculptures upon the outer wall. This gallery of sculptures, which forms the exterior of the temple, consists of over half a mile of continuous pictures cut in basso-relievo upon sandstone slabs 6 feet in width, and represents subjects taken from Hindu mythology, from the Ramayana, the Sanskrit epic poem of India, with its 25,000 verses describing the exploits of the god Rama and the son of the king of Od. The contest of the king of Ceylon and Hananuma, the monkey god, are graphically represented. There is no keystone used in the arch of this corridor. On the walls is sculptured the immense number of 100,000 separate figures. One picture from the Ramayana occupies 240 feet of the wall. Wow! In the Nagan Wat, as many as 1,532 solid columns have been counted, and among the entire ruins of Angkor, the immense number of 6,000, almost all of them hewn from single blocks and artistically carved. That is wild. Like, one picture, 240 feet, may not seem like it's that impressive, but if you mess up in a bas relief, there is no fixing that. But who built Nagan Wat, and when was it built? Landmen have attempted to form opinions from studies of its construction, and especially on imitation, and have failed. Native Cambodian historians, adds Vincent, reckon 2,400 from the building of the temple. I asked one of them how long Nagan Wat had been built. None can tell when. I do not know. It must either have sprung up from the ground or been built by giants, or perhaps by the angels, was the answer. When Stephens asked the native Indians, who built Kapan, what nation traced the hieroglyphic designs, sculptured these elegant figures and carvings, these emblematic designs, the dull answer he received was, "Quien sabe?" Who knows? All is mystery, dark and impenetrable mystery, writes Stephens. In Egypt, the colossal skeletons of gigantic temples stand in all the nakedness of desolation. Here, an immense forest shrouded the ruins, hiding them from sight. But there are perhaps many circumstances, trifling for archaeologists unacquainted with the idle and fanciful legends of old, hence overlooked. Otherwise, the discovery might have sent them on a new train of thought. One is the invariable presence in the Egyptian, Mexican, and Siamese ruined temples of the monkey. The Egyptian cynocephalus assumes the same postures as the Hindu and Siamese Hanuma, and among the sculptured fragments of Copan, Stephens finds the remains of colossal apes or baboons, strongly resembling in outline and appearance the 4 monstrous animals which once stood in front, attached to the base of the obelisk at Luxor, and now in Paris, and which, under the name of the cynocephalae, were worshipped at Thebes. In almost every Buddhist temple there are idols of huge monkeys kept, and some people have in their houses white monkeys on purpose to keep the bad spirits away. Was civilization, writes Louis de Carne, in the complex meaning we give that word, in keeping among the ancient Cambodians with what such prodigies of architecture seem to indicate? The age of Phidias was that of Sophocles, Socrates, and Plato. Michelangelo and Raphael succeeded Dante. There are luminous epochs during which the human mind, developing itself in every direction, triumphs in all, and creates masterpieces which spring from the same inspiration. Nag Con Wat, concludes Vincent, must be ascribed to other than ancient Cambodians, but to whom there exist no credible traditions. All is absurd or legend. The latter sentence has become of late a sort of catchphrase in the mouths of travelers and archaeologists when they have found that no clue is attainable unless it can be found in popular legends. They turn away discouraged, and a final verdict is withheld. At the same time, Vincent quotes a writer who remarks that these ruins are as imposing as the ruins at Thebes or Memphis, but more mysterious. Mouhot thinks that they were erected by some ancient Michelangelo, and adds that Nagan Wat is grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome. Furthermore, Mouhot ascribes the building again to some of the lost tribes of Israel, and is corroborated in that opinion by Miche, the French bishop of Cambodia, who confesses that he is struck by the Hebrew character of the faces of many of the average savage scenes. Henry Mouhot believes that, without exaggeration, the oldest pots of Angkor can be fixed at more than 2,000 years ago. This, then, in comparison with the pyramids, would make them quite modern. The date is the more incredible because the pictures on the walls may be proved to belong to those archaic ages when Poseidon and the Kabiyeri were worshipped throughout the continent. Had Nagan Wat been built, as Dr. Adolf Bastian would have it, for the reception of the land patriarch Buddhaghosa, who brought the holy books of the tribe Pidok from Ceylon, or, as Bishop Feligo, who refers to the erection of this edifice to the reign of Frith Pathum Sturving, when the sacred books of the Buddhists were brought from Ceylon, and Buddhism became the religion of the Cambodians. How is it possible to account for the following? We see in this same temple carved images of Buddha, 4 and even 32 armed, and 2 and 16-headed gods. The Indian Vishnu, gods with wings, Burmese heads, Hindu figures in Ceylon mythology. You see warriors residing upon elephants and in chariots, foot soldiers with shield and spear, boats, tigers, griffins, serpents, fishes, crocodiles, bullocks, soldiers of immense physical development with helmets, and some people with beards, probably Moors. The figures, adds Mr. Vincent, stand somewhat like those in the great Egyptian monuments, the side apparently turned towards the front, and I noticed besides 5 horsemen, armed with spear and sword, riding abreast, like those seen upon the Assyrian tablets in the British Museum. For our part, we may add that there are on the walls several repetitions of Dagon, the man-fish of the Babylonians, and of the Kabirian gods of Samothrace. This may have escaped the notice of the few archaeologists who examine the place, but upon stricter inspection they will be found there, as well as the reputed father of the Kabiyeri, Vulcan, with his bolts and implements, having near him a king with a scepter in his hand, which is the counterpart of the Cheronia, or the scepter of Agamemnon, so called, said to have been presented to him by the lame god of Lemnos. In another place we find Vulcan, recognizable by his hammer and pincers, but under the shape of a monkey, as usually represented by the Egyptians. Now, if Nagan Wat is essentially a Buddhist temple, how comes it to have on its walls basso-relievos of a completely an Assyrian character, and Kabirian gods which, though universally worshipped as the most ancient of the Asiatic mystery gods, had already been abandoned 200 years BC, and the Samothracian mysteries themselves completely altered? Whence the popular tradition concerning the Prince of Rama among the Cambodians, a personage mentioned by all the native historians who attribute to him the foundation of the temple? Is it not barely possible that even the Ramayana itself, the famous epic poem, is but the original of Homer's Iliad, as it was suggested some years ago? The beautiful Peri carrying off Helen looks very much like Ravana, king of the giants, eloping with Sita, Rama's wife. The Trojan War is a counterpart of the Ramayana War. Moreover, Herodotus assures us that the Trojan heroes and gods date in Greece only from the date of the Iliad. In such a case, even Hananuma, the monkey god, would be but Vulcan in disguise. The more so that the Cambodian tradition makes the founder of Angkor come from Roma, which they place at the western end of the world, and that the Hindu Roma also apportions the west to the descendants of Hananuma. Hypothetical as the suggestion may now seem, it is worthy of consideration, if even for the sake of being refuted. The Abbé Jacquenet, the Catholic missionary in Cochin, China, ever ready to connect the least glimmer of historical light with that of the Christian revelation, writes, "Whether we consider the commercial relations with the Jews, when, in the height of their power, the combined fleets of Hiram and Solomon went to seek the treasures of Ophir, or whether we come lower down to the dispersion of the 10 tribes, who, instead of returning from captivity, set out from the banks of the Euphrates and reached the shores of the ocean, the shining of the light of revelation in the far east is not the less incontestable. It looks certainly incontestable enough if we reverse the position and admit that all the light that ever shone on the Israelites came to them from this far east, passing first through the Chaldeans and Egyptians. The first thing to settle is to find out who were the Israelites themselves, and that is the most vital question. Many historians seem to claim, with good reason, that the Jews were similar or identical with the ancient Phoenicians. But the Phoenicians were beyond any doubt an Ethiopian race. Moreover, the present race of Punjab are hybridized with the Asiatic Ethiopians. Herodotus traced the Hebrews to the Persian Gulf, and south of that place were the Himyarites, the Arabians. Beyond the early Chaldeans and Sassanians, the great builders. This seems to establish pretty well their Ethiopian affinity. Megasthenes says that the Jews were an Indian sect called Kalani, and their theology resembled that of the Indians. Other authors also suspect that the colonized Jews, or the Judeans, were the Yadus from Afghanistan, the old India. Eusebius tells us that the Ethiopians came from the river Indus and settled near Egypt. More research may show that the Tamil Hindus, who are accused by the missionaries of worshipping the devil, Kuti Satan, only honor, after all, Seth or Satan, worshipped by the biblical Hittites. But if the Jews were in the twilight of history, the Phoenicians, the latter may be traced themselves to the nations who used the old Sanskrit language. Carthage was a Phoenician city, hence its name. For Tyre was equally Cartha. In the Bible, the words Kir, Kirjath, are frequently found. Their tutelar god was styled Melkartha, Mel, Baal, or tutelar lord of the city. In Sanskrit, a city or communal was in a kul, and its lord was Hari. Hari Kulas is therefore the translation of Melkarth in Sanskrit in origin. Moreover, all the Cyclopean races were Phoenician. In the Odyssey, the Cyclopes, are the Libyan shepherds, and Herodotus describes them as miners and great builders. They are the ancient Titans, or giants, who, in Hesiod, forged bolts for Zeus. They are the biblical Zamzumin of the land of the giants, the Anakim. Now it is easy to see that the excavators of Ellora, the builders of the old pagodas, the architects of Copan and the ruins of Central America, those of Nagonwad and those of the Egyptian remains were, if not of the same race, at least of the same religion, the one taught in the oldest mysteries. Besides, the figures on the walls of Angkor are purely archaic, and have nothing to do with the images and idols of Buddha, who may be of a far later origin. What gives a peculiar interest to this section, says Dr. Bastian, is the fact that the has represented the different nationalities in all their distinctive characteristic features, from the flat-nosed savage in the tasseled garb of the Panom and the short-haired Lao to the straight-nosed Rajput with sword and shield and the bearded Moor, giving a catalogue of nationalities like another column of Trajan in the predominant physical conformation of each race. On the whole, there is such a prevalence of Hellenistic cast in features and profiles, as well as in the elegant attitude of the horseman, that one might suppose Xenocrates of old, after finishing his labors in Bombay, had made an excursion to the east. Therefore, if we allow the tribes of Israel to have had a hand in the building of Nekon Wat, it cannot be as the tribes numbered and sent from the wilderness of Paran in search of the land of Canaan, but as their earliest ancestors, which amount to the rejection of such tribes as the casting of a reflection of the Mosaic revelation. And where is the outside historical evidence that such tribes were ever heard of at all, before the compilation of the Old Testament by Ezra? There are archaeologists who strongly regard the 12 tribes as utterly mythical, for there never was a tribe of Simeon, and that of Levi was a caste. There still remains the same problem to solve, whether the Judeans had ever been in Palestine before Cyrus. From the sons of Jacob, who had all married Canaanites except Joseph, whose wife was the daughter of an Egyptian priest of the sun, down to the legendary book of Judges, there was an acknowledged general intermarrying between the said tribes and the idolatrous races. And the children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites, Hittites, and Amorites, and Perizzites, and Hivites, and Jebusites. And they took their daughters to be their wives, and gave their daughters to their sons, and served their gods, says the 3rd chapter of Judges. And the children of Israel forgot their God, and served Baalim and the groves. This Baal was Moloch, Malakarta, or Hercules. He was worshipped wherever the Phoenicians went. How could the Israelites possibly keep together as tribes, while, on the authority of the Bible itself, whole populations were from year to year uprooted violently by Assyrian and other conquerors? So was Israel carried away out of their own land to Assyria unto this day. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, and from Cuthah, and from Avah, and from Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria, instead of the children of Israel. And the language of Palestine became in time Semitic. It is because the Assyrian influence. For Phoenicia had become a dependency as early as the days of Hiram, and the Phoenicians evidently changed their language, from Hamitic to Semitic. Assyria was the land of Nimrod, from Nimr spotted, and Nimrod was Bacchus, and his spotted leopard skin. The leopard skin is the sacred appendage of the mysteries. It was used in the Eleusinian as well as the Egyptian mysteries. It is found sculptured on the basso-relievos of Central American ruins, covering the backs of the sacrificers. It is mentioned in the earliest speculations of the Brahmins on the meaning of their sacrificial prayers, the Atareya Brahmanan. It is used in the Agnishtoma, the initiation rites of the Soma mystery. When the neophyte is to be born again, he is covered with a leopard skin, out of which he emerges as from his mother's womb. The Kabiari were also Assyrian gods. They had different names. In the common language they were known as Jupiter and Bacchus, and sometime as Achiocheros and Askieros, Achiosera and Cadmilis. And even the true number of these deities was uncertain with the people. They had other names in the sacred language, known but to the hierophants and priests, and it was not lawful to mention them. How is it then that we find them reproduced in the Samothracian postures on the walls of Nakhon Wat? How is it again that we find them pronounced, albeit slightly disfigured, as known in that same sacred language by the populations of Siam, Tibet, and India? The name Kabiari may be a derivation from Abir, great, Ebir, an astrologer, or Jabir, an associate. And they were worshipped at Hebron, the city of the Anunnakis, the giants. The name Abraham, according to Dr. Wilder, has a very Kiberian look. The word Heber, or Geber, may be the etymological root of the Hebrews, as applied to Nimrod and the Bible giants of the 6th chapter of Genesis, but we must seek for their origin far earlier than the days of Moses. The name Phoenician affords its own proof. They are called by Manetho or Anakis, which shows the Anakis or Anakim of Canaan, with whom the people of Israel, if not identical in race, had, by intermarriage, become entirely absorbed, were the Phoenicians, and the problematical Hyksos, as Manetho has it, and whom Josephus once declared were direct ancestors of the Israelites. Therefore, it is in this jumble of contradictory opinions, authorities, and historical olapodria that we must look for a solution of the mystery. So long as the origin of Hyksos is not positively settled, we can know nothing certain of the Israelitish people, who, either wittingly or otherwise, have mixed up their chronology and origin in such an inextricable tangle. But if the Hyksos can be proved to have been the Pali shepherds of the Indus, who partially removed to the east and came over from the nomadic Aryan tribes of India, then perhaps it would account for the biblical myths being so mixed up with the Aryan and Asiatic mystery gods. As Dunlap says, the Hebrews came out of Egypt among the Canaanites. They need not be traced beyond the Exodus. That is their historical beginning. It was very easy to cover up this remote event by the recital of mythical traditions, and to prefix it an account of their origin in which the gods, patriarchs, should figure as their ancestors. But it is not their historical beginning which is the vital question for the world of science and theology. It is their religious beginning. And if we can trace it through the Hyksos, Phoenicians, and the Ethiopian builders and the Chaldeans, whether it is to the Hindus that we later owe their learning, or the Brahmins who owe it to the Chaldeans, we have the means in hand to trace every so-called revealed dogmatical assertion in the Bible to its origin, which we have to search for in the twilight of history, and before the separation of the Aryan and Semitic families. How can we do it better, or more surely, than through means afforded us by archaeology? Picture writing can be destroyed, but if it survives, it cannot lie. And if we find the same myths, ideas, and secret symbols on monuments all over the world, and if, moreover, these monuments can be shown to antedate the 12 chosen tribes, can we then, unerringly, show that instead of being a direct divine revelation, it was but an incomplete recollection or tradition among a tribe which had been identified and mixed up for centuries before the apparition of Abraham, with all the three great world families, namely the Aryan, Semitic, and Turanian nations, if so they must be called. The teraphim of Abraham's father, Terah, the maker of images, were the Kabiri gods, and we see them worshipped by Micah, by the Danites, and others. Teraphim were identical with the seraphim, and these were serpent images, the origin of which is the Sanskrit scarpa, the serpent, a symbol sacred to all the deities as a symbol of immortality. Kayun, or the god Kivan, worshipped by the Hebrews in the wilderness, is Siva, the Hindu, as well as Saturn. The Greek story shows that Dardanus, the Arcadian, having received them as a dowry, carried them to Samothrace, and from thence to Troy, and they were worshipped far before the days of glory of Tyre or Sidon, though the former had been built 2760 BC. From where did Dardanus derive them? It is an easy matter to assign an age to ruins on merely the external evidence of probabilities. It is more difficult to prove it. Meanwhile, the rockworks of Ruad, Peritias, Marathos, and resemble those of Petra, Baalbek, and other Ethiopian works, even externally. On the other hand, the assertions of certain archaeologists who find no resemblance between the temples of Central America and those of Egypt and Siam, leave the symbologist, acquainted with the secret language of picture writing, perfectly unconcerned. He sees the landmarks of one and the same doctrine on all these monuments, and reads their history and affiliation in signs imperceptible to the uninitiated scientist. There are traditions also, and one of these speaks of the last of the king initiates, who were but rarely admitted to the higher orders of the Eastern Brotherhoods, who reigned in 1760. This king of Siam was the one so ridiculed by the French ambassador, de la Labure, as a lunatic who had been searching all his life for the philosopher's stone. One of such mysterious landmarks is found in the peculiar structure of certain arches in the temples. The author of The Land of the White Elephant remarks as curious, "The absence of the keystone in the arches of the building, and the undecipherable inscriptions. In the ruins of Santa Cruz del Quiche, an arched corridor was found by Stephens, equally without a keystone." Describing the desolate ruins of Palenque, and remarking that the arches of the corridor were all built on this model, and the ceilings in this form, he supposes that the builders were evidently ignorant of the principles of the arc, and support was made by stones lapping over as they rose, as at Oxingo and among Cyclopean remains in Greece and Italy. In other buildings, though they belong to the same group, the traveler found the missing keystone, which is a sufficient proof that its omission elsewhere was premeditated. May we not look for the solution in the mystery in the Masonic Manual? The keystone has an esoteric mystery, meaning, which ought to be, if it is not, well appreciated by high Masons. The most important subterranean building mentioned in the description of the origin of Freemasonry is the one built by Enoch. The patriarch is led by the deity, whom he sees in a vision, into the 9 vaults. After that, with the assistance of his son, Methuselah, he constructs in the land of Canaan, in the bowels of the mountain, 9 apartments on the models that were shown to him in the vision. Each was roofed with an arch, and the apex of each formed a keystone, having inscribed on it the mirific characters. Each of the latter, furthermore, represented one of the 9 names, traced in characters emblematical of the attributes by which the deity was, according to ancient Freemasonry, known to the antediluvian brethren. Then Enoch constructed 2 deltas of the purest gold, and tracing 2 of the mysterious characters on each, he placed one of them in the deepest ark, and the other entrusted to Methuselah, communicating to him at the same time other important secrets now lost to Freemasonry. And so, among the arcane secrets, now lost to their modern successors, may be found also the fact that the keystones were used in the arches only in certain portions of the temples devoted to special purposes. Another similarity, presented by the architectural remains of the religious movements of every country, can be found in the identity of parts, courses, and measurements. All these buildings belong to the age of Hermes Trismegistus, and however comparatively modern or ancient the temple may seem, their mathematical proportions are found to correspond with the Egyptian religious edifices. There is a similar disposition of courtyards, adyta, passages, and steps. Hence, despite any dissimilarity in architectural style, it is a warrantable inference that the religious rites were celebrated in all. Says Dr. Stuckley, concerning Stonehenge, "This structure was not erected upon any Roman measure, and this is demonstrated by the great number of fractions which the measurement of each part, according to European scales, gives. On the contrary, the figures become even as soon as we apply the measurement of the ancient cubit, which was common to the Hebrew children of Shem, as well as to the Phoenicians and Egyptians, children of Ham, and imitators of the monuments of unhewn and oracular stones. The presence of artificial lakes and their peculiar disposition on the consecrated grounds is also a fact of great importance. The lakes inside the precincts of Karnak and those enclosed in the grounds of Nakhon Wat and around the temples in the Mexican Copan and Santa Cruz de Quiche will be found to present the same peculiarities. Besides possessing other significances, the whole area was laid out with reference to cyclic calculations. In the Druidical structures, the same sacred and mysterious numbers will be found. The circle of stones generally consists of either 12 or 21 or 36. In these circles, the center places belongs to Asar, Azon, or the god in the circle, by whatever other name he might have been known. The 13 Mexican serpent gods bear a distant relationship to the 13 stones of the Druidical ruins. The Tao, the astronomical cross of Egypt, are conspicuous in several apertures, and the remains of Palenque. In one of the bas-relievos of the Palace of Palenque, on the west side, sculptured in a hieroglyphic rite under the seated figure, is a Tao. The standing figure, which leans over the first one, is in the act of covering its head with the left hand with the veil of initiation, while it extends its right with the index and middle finger pointing to heaven. The position is precisely that of a Catholic bishop giving his blessing, or the one in which Jesus is often represented while at the Last Supper. Even the Hindu elephant-headed god of wisdom, or magic learning, Ganesh, may be found among the stucco figures of the Mexican ruins. What explanation can the archaeologists, philologists, in short, the chosen host of academicians give us? None whatever. At best they have but a hypothesis, every one of which is likely to be pulled down by its successor. A pseudo-truth, perhaps, like the first. The keys to the biblical miracles of old and to the phenomena of modern days, the problems of psychology, physiology, and the many missing links, which have so perplexed scientists of late, are all in the hands of secret fraternities. This mystery might be unveiled someday, but till then dark skepticism will constantly interpose its threatening, ugly shadow between God's truth and the spiritual vision of mankind. And many are those who, infected by the mortal epidemic of our century, hopeless materialism, will remain in doubt and mortal agony as to whether, when man dies, he will live again, although the question has been solved by long bygone generations of sages. The answers are there. They may be found on the time-worn granite pages of cave temples, on sphinxes, propylons, and obelisks. They have stood there for untold ages, and neither the rude assault of time, nor the still ruder assault of Christian hands, have succeeded in obliterating their records. All covered with the problems which were solved, who can tell, perhaps, by the archaic forefathers of their builders. The solution follows each question, and this the Christian could not appropriate, for except the initiates, no one has understood the mystic writing. The key was in the keeping of those who knew how to commune with the invisible presence, and who had received from the lips of Mother Nature herself her grand truths. And so stand these monuments like mute, forgotten sentinels on the threshold of that unseen world, whose gates are thrown open, but to a very few elect. Defying the hands of time, the vain inquiry of profane science, the insults of those revealed religions, they will disclose their riddles to none but the legatees of those by whom they were entrusted with the mystery. The cold, stony lips of the once vocal Memnon and of the hardy sphinxes keep their secrets well. Who will unseal them? Who, of our modern materialistic dwarfs and unbelieving Sadducees, will dare to lift the veil of Isis? And so ends chapter 14. That was an exceptionally long one. I'm so glad my voice held out as long as it did. That was amazing. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a series of somewhat difficult topics. I understand that I have some unconventional beliefs and that I have a tendency to step on toes when I convey those. It is not intentional, but I do not apologize for it. I had a few things to add, but not a whole lot, because once again, this was just a recitation of various historical elements, some of which may be facts. I hold an alternative view on many things, and they are contained in these playlists if you would like more elucidation on the things which I have spoken of. I have tried to point out which playlist would be relevant to which point, but there's cross between them, so some of them contain things that are also contained in the others. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, share, and a sub. Throw me a comment if you agree or disagree. If it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If there is another work you would like to see me talk about in the manner that we are doing here, leave that in the comments as well. And if you really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that super thanks.
To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just the way that you are. And this has been Pit Steak. Peace.